Mic check. Mic.
Everybody would take a seat. We'll begin. If everybody would please stand, Mr. Councilman John Amady is going to lead us in a prayer followed by the pledge.
Thank you. Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight, Lord, and we thank you for all the blessings that you bestow upon this parish. For 200 years, Lord, we ask that your favor would continue for 200 plus more, Lord. We ask that your favor would be upon all the citizens of this parish, and that this parish would be blessed in such a way that it's able to overflow into others and helping them. Lord, we thank you for all who have come out tonight. We ask that they would be enjoying themselves in this presentation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty, justice for all.
Thank you, Councilman Amady, and welcome to our fourth installment in the 200th anniversary of Terrebonne Parish Celebration. My name is Darren Guidry. I am a council chairman this year, and I welcome you. I'd like to also recognize a few other council members. Of course, you met Mr. John Amady. Councilman Danny Babin is also in the audience. We also have former parish president Michelle Claude and current director of the Council on Aging. Welcome, Michelle. We also have former parish manager Al Levron is here. We also have Mr. Art DeFreitas, who is going to give us an interesting presentation, who probably knows more about some of the waterways in Terrebonne Parish than most. We also have a former judge, Jude Fungi is here. Welcome. And before we begin, of course, today we're speaking about the environment, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the environment and what makes Terrebonne Parish special. Of course, our name is Terrebonne, which is French for good earth. And having served on the levee board since 2008, the next year in 2009, we began what was perhaps the biggest environmental project, arguably in the nation. I know we think of it as a hurricane protection, but you're going to hear about some of the historic waterways and bayous that we had in our area. And because of subsidence and erosion, a lot of those had become open water. Well, one of the things taken into mind when building the Marganza system was to leave openings where the historic bayous were to help retain some of the history and some of the environment that we had. Hopefully these closures will help us protect what we have, and maybe through time perhaps even add a little bit of sediment and maybe help in some of the subsidence. Some of the other things that are going on, of course, in 1962, you're going to hear about probably the Houma Navigation Canal, which was dug. But moving forward, we broke ground this year on the Homa Lock Complex. Of course, the Homa Navigation Canal was great for the economy, but then caused saltwater intrusion to come in and caused an extra hurt for our environment. So this lock structure is going to help us prevent that saltwater intrusion. That will be open in 2025. So that's going to be really good for our environment. And of course, to get to our waterways, you need boat launches. We have some public boat launches, and the council just accepted a boat launch along Petit Caillou at Bush Canal into the parish system. So that will be upgraded. We'll also build a fishing pier because, again, to enjoy our environment and you don't have a boat, you need to have some way to fish off the waterways. So we're going to have a pier built there very similar to what we have in the Bayou Country Sports Park. We're also looking at in the future of building a nature walk in the Savannah Swamp area, which would be a 5-mile nature walk, which would also help people get into the environment. And, we're working constantly on that. We're working on things like grass cutting in our environment. I believe we're going to be discussing that at our upcoming council meeting. I think we have some proposals that we can take over parts of the grass cutting from the state. And perhaps next year, we're working on a plan to present of maybe taking over a lot of those state roadways, which is where a lot of our problem with grass and litter is, which all affect our environment, and we're working on that. We're also talking about lilies in our bayous, which also affect our environment. As you know, the water hyacinths really aren't native to our particular area, but they become invasive, as well as some of the other plants. And so that is also something that, the parish is going to have to work together with the state. And hopefully that is something else that we can control as well, because the spraying of the lilies hasn't really worked. The whole idea of the spray is to have the lilies sink to the bottom, but most of what you see in some of the bayous, especially in my council district in Bayou Black, it's not just water hyacinths. So they don't sink, and they end up, the spraying provides minimal solution. So they're going to have to be removed in some way, and there are contractors who do that sort of thing, but that is currently being discussed among our council members and among our parish president. And of course, our urban forest environment has been tremendously damaged with the storm. But surprisingly, the forest that is left seems to be very happy this year. And I don't know exactly what it is, if it knew that there was a storm, or maybe they have less competition. But what the forest we do have remaining seems to be very healthy around the parish. But we're also working through our tree board to encourage that moving forward, especially after we recover, and get past the recovery stage of this particular storm. So those are some of the few of the things that we're looking at doing environmentally. And I'm going to turn the program over to Earl Hughes to discuss a little bit about the history as we celebrate the 200th anniversary of Terrebonne and our environment. Earl.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Darren, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our environmental section presentation this evening. We hope that you enjoy the presentations that we have. Our presenters have worked very hard on trying to give everyone a great presentation. The environment here in Terrebonne Parish is very diverse. We have bottomland hardwoods here. We have lots of agriculture lands. We have our freshwater and saltwater marshes. We have our great estuaries that produce abundance of seafood for us. And believe it or not, we do have some beaches which are on our barrier islands, if you wanted to consider it a beach. So what we're going to try to do today is give y'all some insight on a few of the issues that have occurred in Terrebonne Parish through environmental issues. And I just want to remind everybody that it's a very broad subject, and there's a lot of things that we could talk about regarding the environment. So we had to narrow it down so that we would get you out of here in a decent amount of time. So having doing some of the research myself on the topics that I'm going to speak about, it's very hard not to talk about the entire industry, not just the environmental impacts that those industries have presented to us here in Terrebonne Parish. So just to give you all a kind of an informational source, regulatory issues in the United States and within Terrebonne Parish basically started around the early 70s when the United States Environmental Protection Agency came about, who started making regulations, federal regulations on pollution issues throughout the United States. And then in the mid 80s, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality was formed, and I think Governor David Treen was the governor at the time, to start looking at state regulatory issues within our area. Also, we do have some ordinances through the Terrebonne Parish government that provide some regulatory issue, to provide regulatory overlook on issues that happen here in Terrebonne Parish. So, we're celebrating 200 years, but the environmental regulatory aspect of the environment hasn't been in effect for 200 years. So some of the issues that you're going to hear about, you'll hear about some issues that were, maybe 100 years ago, maybe some further than that. But like I said, there were no regulatory agencies 200 years ago. So today, some of the presentations are going to be on habitat loss. We'll have presentations on the potable or drinking water system here in Terrebonne Parish. We'll talk about some environmental events that have occurred and has affected the environment here in Terrebonne Parish. And then we'll talk about some environmental mitigation issues that have taken place in Terrebonne to fix some of the environmental damages that may have been caused through industry or even governmental projects. So today, our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Mr. Kerry St. Pay. He has recently retired as the director of the Barataria Terrebonne National Estuary Program. He was the director there from 1997 to July of 2014. The Barataria Terrebonne National Estuary Program is a nationally recognized effort dedicated to preserving and restoring the 4.2 million acre area between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers in southeast Louisiana. Prior to 1997, Kerry worked for 25 years as a field biologist for the Water Pollution Control Division of the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. His wetland restoration work has been featured in the best-selling book, Bayou Farewell, The Rich Life and Tragic Death of Louisiana's Cajun Coast by Mike Tidwell, and most recently in the PBS documentary, Washing Away, Losing Louisiana, and the LPB documentary, Turning the Tide. In May of 2010, Kerry was awarded an honorary doctorate of science by Nicholls State University. He was presented with the James Lynn Powell Award in March of 2012 by the Nicholls Alumni Federation, which is the highest honor awarded to a alumnus of Nicholls State University. So without further ado, Kerry St. Pay.
That was supposed to be short. I'm on. Thank you. Thank you very much, Earl. As Earl said, I retired in 2014. So I've been retired for a while, and we were talking but earlier that we have to get back in the shape of being able to give these presentations. I am going to come to you from the position that the estuary program is, and about restoration, about habitat loss. The estuary program started in 1991 and spent 5 years gathering the science with hundreds of people, and we developed a consensus-based, something that everybody can live with, a restoration plan. So I'm coming to you with that in mind. So Hornet Kane was a prominent journalist in New Orleans. He wrote several books, and in his 1944 book, Deep Delta Country, his opening paragraph described why this place is often called unique. Yeah, I don't know if you're the same, but people all my life have been referring to this place as unique. You guys are unique. Your place is unique. And I never traveled anywhere. I went every now and then. We went to Mississippi, at far-off land, Mississippi, on vacation. And but we all took this place for granted. I never thought this place as being unique. But Hornet Kane wrote, pouring down out of North America's heart, the Mississippi nears the end of its long travels, and suddenly it finds itself in a new land, a region in some ways like no other in the world. And it can be admitted that the terrain and the population alter before the eye. This area is very different than most areas of the world. Hornet Kane was describing what became the Terrebonne National Estuary in 1991. BITNEP is one of the 28 national estuary programs throughout the U.S. And this slide is the watersheds of the national estuary programs. These little colored features are the watersheds. And you can see some watersheds. And you see this very large watershed. It's our watershed. Drains 2/3 of the United States and 2 Canadian provinces. All this water comes down and builds or to the National Estuary Program, the National Estuary. We live at the end of one of the world's great rivers. Over thousands of years, the Mississippi flooded its banks each spring, creating natural levees close to the main channel, where the heavier sediments settled out rapidly. The lighter particles stayed suspended longer, creating swamps and marshes. So we ended up with these fingers or ridges, and between those ridges, the marshes and swamps. And these ridges are where we built our homes, our industry, our schools, our roads. So for generations, we've lived here under the protection of the vast land masses between us and the Gulf. This map is a map of it was built in 1806, commissioned by Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase. And my own ancestor came here in 1760, and most of our people, I'm sure a high percentage of you guys, can point to your first ancestor that came here generations ago. It's not like the rest of the U.S. You know, maybe some of you came here recently, but I guarantee you'll probably stay because it's a good place to live. Most regions of the U.S. don't experience this tendency to stay in a region. We may be forced to move because of hurricanes. Where I grew up in Port South, Louisiana, Port South was destroyed by Katrina. It's nothing like it was. But people, where did they move? They moved to Belchase, not far. It's the land, it's the ecology, it's what keeps us here. But this area has changed dramatically. I showed you a picture of, Pierre Saint-Pé, and where he lived in 1706. And there were vast marshes, ridges extending from his house all the way to the Gulf. The feet is about right here now. And Pierre probably experienced hurricanes. I'm sure he had hurricanes, but they didn't push, tens of feet of storm surge to wash his house away. Might have had a few trees blowing over into his house. The fresh and intermediate brackish and saline marshes have moved northward due to changes to the ecology of our system. We don't have the protections that we once had. So one thing we did is to change the natural flow of water in our system with navigation canals. The Houma Navigation Canal, which Darren mentioned earlier, brought salt water to our drinking water supply, our main drinking water supply in Houma. We can't use it anymore because it's too salty. The Houma Navigation Canal was dredged as a relatively narrow channel, but widened over the years, and now you can see very high rates of tidal movement in the water at the Intracoastal Waterway. Oil and gas canals, we cut those indiscriminately. This is an old picture of Leeville. Now it's just open water. These canals also brought salt water into our fresh marshes. Highly saline produced water, oilfield brine, which was legally discharged in Louisiana until 2000, killed marshes directly. Something you don't hear a lot about is that the removal of fluids from the earth has caused a collapse of the earth's surface above fault lines. As you remove oil and gas and water, these faults are activated, they suddenly release and drop. That's caused a lot of land loss, a lot of marsh loss. I often wonder if much of this sudden subsidence of our marsh system could have been avoided if we would have required the oil industry to re-inject produced water back into the formation. Something else we did is we reduced sediment availability to our marshes. We did this after the 1927 floods, when we petitioned Congress to upgrade the levees along the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya rivers to protect us from flooding. There were levees existing before, but they were little rudimentary, really low levees, not enough to keep the Mississippi River from flooding. People lived on the levees that existed back then in 1927 for months. As you can see, some of these people, some of the hogs lived on there too. Building of levees on the Mississippi River interrupted the annual deposition of sediments to our marshes. Something else you don't hear a lot about. Since 1850, the suspended sediment load in the Mississippi River has declined by 50 to 80%. Hundreds of locks and dams built in the upper watershed slow the river, allowing sediments to settle behind these structures. They stay suspended as long as the energy in a river moves faster and can keep these sediments suspended. When it slows, they sink out. This becomes very important when considering how we are going to restore our system. Hydrologic modification, meaning we change the way water naturally flows, and reduction in sediment availability are largely responsible for our habitat loss. The Terrebonne National Estuary is disappearing faster than any other area in the world. Without the protection of our coastal land masses, we are forced to build levees to protect us. We've all seen dead oaks on these sinking ridges, and these ridges are very important as far as protection from storm surge, because you have essentially a levee out, a ridge in the marsh with another 20 feet of oak trees. That's going to stop a storm surge. So now I'm going to start this animation. I'm going to take you from 1930 to 2020. This is known land loss. And then I'm going to project it out into 2050. It's a scary thought. Y'all want to see it again? (1930, 1950, 1970). Some of these places, the only areas you have left are the areas within levees. We lost over 200 square miles of land for Katrina and Rita. One event. So that animation I just showed you couldn't predict when we'd have a hurricane. So you add that to what you saw. We lost 106 square miles of land from Ida. This area is the area around Clovelly Farms, around Little Lake. This was all very healthy marsh. It was high marsh, meaning it was very healthy. It wasn't floton marsh, it was high marsh. Ida just blew it away. That's tremendous land loss. Our current culture depends on the existing salinity regimes. Fresh brackish saline marshes allow us to raise oysters, catch shrimp, speckled trout, bass. We necessarily need to expect some changes if we expect to restore this place. The question is, what degree of change can we accept? What degree of change what degree of change to our culture can we accept? The concept of a big diversion, river diversion, introducing water from the Mississippi River or Chapelire River. The concept of a big diversion has gotten much bigger in recent years. The planned mid-barrier diversion increased from 15,000 CFS in 2012 to now what they're saying is going to be a 70,000 cubic feet per second diversion in 2022. At such large scales, there are serious negative impacts. Socio-political opposition, user conflicts, and other obstacles to implementation generally increase with scale. We could turn the entire Barataria Basin into a freshwater system when the river's high. That's when this diversion would take place. When the river is low in the summer, you can't introduce water. So any time or any fresh marshes you would have created are going to just die from saltwater intruding when you're not diverting water from the Mississippi River. And what about flooding? We're gonna use this diversion into the late spring, early summer. And what do we have in early summer, late spring? A little thing we call hurricanes. Are we going to be able to use these big diversions? Diversions do effectively combat saltwater intrusion, but do they need to be so big? Freshwater and nutrients alone can sustain marshes. But to sustain our way of life, we need to rebuild as much land as we can. The Mississippi River, I showed you, doesn't have the sediment load it had when it created us. It reduced by 50 to 80%. Took thousands of years to build us. So how long is it going to take to build land? Now, freshwater and nutrients alone can't sustain marshes. We need to consider relying more on using dredge sediments. Dredge sediments from the bottom of the river. That's where the sediment is. The Corps still dredges header passes. Every year, they got to dredge out header passes. They've been using this beneficially, but not too long ago, they were releasing it offshore and into the Gulf because it was one of their regulations that they had to dispose of the dredge material in the cheapest way possible, and they felt it was cheaper to dump it offshore. I could have probably made a case of it. Well, it might be cheaper in the long run to use it to build marshes, barrier islands, ridges. All habitat types must be restored, not just freshwater dependent ones. We need to restore ridges, we need to restore barrier islands. Maintaining healthy salinity regimes allows our culture to exist. Landscape restoration allows coastal communities to exist. Louisiana has completed several sediment delivery projects on barrier islands and in coastal marshes, but they still are focused on delivering massive amounts of fresh water as a primary restoration tool. They're relying on these big diversions as a restoration tool. The fresh water would come into the Barataria Basin, not Terrebonne. Terrebonne is not close to the Mississippi. It's fairly close to the Atchafalaya. The Atchafalaya has a lot of sediment. The whole Atchafalaya Basin is filling up with sediment. We need to devise some kind of way to get that sediment to Terrebonne Parish. The point I'm making is our ecology, the place we live, is responsible for the culture we have. So we need to restore and to maintain our culture. Thank you. You want to do questions now, Earl? Okay, we'll do questions later, if y'all have any.
Thank you, Kerry. Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Arthur DeFreitas. He will be giving us a presentation on the Terrebonne water quality and our potable water system here. Mr. DeFreitas received a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Tulane University in June of 1953 and was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Navy. He served 3 years aboard a hydrographic survey ship in the Atlantic and Caribbean. He returned to Tulane and earned a Master of Science degree in Civil Engineering in June of 1958. He joined his father's consulting engineering firm, DeFreitas Associates Incorporated, and later became the president of its subsidiaries, Gulf South Engineers Incorporated and GSE Associates Incorporated. He served as consultant to the Waterworks District Number 1 and many of the sewer districts in Terrebonne Parish. He was responsible for the planning, public financing, and design of much of the infrastructure of Terrebonne Parish. Mr. DeFreitas retired in August of 2009. Mr. DeFreitas.
Thank you. This morning when I'm on this, but I'm on. This morning, when each of y'all got up, went to the kitchen, and got yourself a glass of water, I doubt if any of you all thought it has taken over 100 years of infrastructure development and construction to bring that glass of water to you. What I'm going to discuss a little bit today and try to give you some insight into is the problems that the parish has with regards to drinking water, sanitation and sewers, and then some of the discharges from industrial waters into the marshlands. One of the basic needs in order to have a good water distribution system, first of all, is to have a source of raw water. And that raw water frequently in most of the state is able to come from groundwater, from the aquifers. Unfortunately, the aquifer that served this area misses Terrebonne Parish completely. It starts off in the north part of the state and it swings on over into the to the east of the parish. And as you can see,
Speak a little closer to the microphone.
come closer.
A little closer, a little
I
louder.
think I'm using which one am I on? Okay. You'll notice where Terrebonne Parish is, down in this area in here, all the aquifers completely misses. So the only source of raw water that we would have would be essentially from the Mississippi River. And that's how nature intended it. They had Mississippi River had a tributary that branched off at Donaldsonville and Bayou Lafourche, and then Bayou Lafourche branched off into Bayou Terrebonne at Thibodaux, and then we've spread out into the 5 bayous that we come out of Terrebonne Parish with. Prior to 1923, the main source of water for Terrebonne Parish development was cisterns. And Bayou Lafourche was blocked off in 1903, and that took away any source of other water down to Terrebonne Parish. When they blocked it off, you can see where Bayou Lafourche is. They promised to build a lock there to allow water to continue to come down, but they never got around to doing that yet. So the parish relied on cisterns, which was basically rainwater coming off the roof, and that was their source. The first oil and gas development started in Terrebonne Parish in 1917 and 1920 with the Leeret field discovery. This began to change. Until this time, Terrebonne was basically an agricultural and fishing community, and the population was fairly low. In 1923, with a population of 5,200 people, the city of Houma built the first water plant and the power plant combination. The source of raw water for that was essentially what was then the Anacostia Canal. We call it now the Houma Canal, and later the big Anacostia Canal that was built by the Corps came through part of it, but the water plant was taking water from that source. And occasionally, even then, you had trouble with saltwater intrusion because the Miners Canal was putting in salt water into Big Bayou Black. Let's see if I can find where. All right. The water plant is down here, and it is taking the water from the canal. This is Big Bayou Black and Little Bayou Black, the convergence of them. And then this is the Houma Canal at that time, which later became part of the Intercoastal Canal. And this was the entire city of Houma and their water system in 1923. In 1930, Bayou Terrebonne was further sealed off from Bayou Lafourche. There was very little navigation at that time in Bayou Terrebonne, and the bayou was silting in, so the city or someone built Canal Boulevard and closed off Bayou Terrebonne. So at that time, there was no connection at all to those waters. In 1947, the Corps of Engineers made a study. We were still talking about putting a lock at Donaldsonville, and they decided that to recommend they put a pump station instead of the locks. In 1948, Waterworks District Number 1 was formed by the parish of Terrebonne, and that particular district was formed, the entire parish, outside the present limits of the city of Houma. Well, the city objected to the district, and some of the local businessmen objected to the taxes, and the project didn't go anyplace, so it just went dormant. The state built then the pump station at Donaldsonville, and the state created the Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District. Now, that district was formed and a board was made up in proportion to the assessed evaluation of each of the parishes. And Ascension Parish had 1, Assumption 2, and Lafourche had 4 members. Terrebonne Parish, if it had been included, there would have been 5 members from Terrebonne Parish, and the other boards all objected to them having that many board members. So when the act was finally passed to create the Lafourche Freshwater District, Terrebonne was excluded. This is the pump station that was eventually built by the state at Donaldsonville to put water into Bayou Lafourche headwaters. In 1951, several businessmen, Mr. Bob Prentice, Mr. Armand Porsche, and Mr. Lionel Babin, who some of y'all remember those gentlemen, they approached the police jury and wanted to go back and to reactivate the Waterworks District. And compromise action, the district was formed, and it created, the one that was created was primarily wards 1, 3 outside of the city limits of some additional areas, and then 5, 6, and 7. In 1953, the shrimp processors down in Grand Caillou wanted to have water also. So they petitioned a jury and they formed Waterworks District Number 2, which was all Ward 4. They also bought water from the city of Houma, and they also had a contract with Water District Number 1 to operate them. In 1956, the rest of the parish said, well, why don't we have water? So they got together and they petitioned the parish government, and wards 2, 8, 9, and 10 were put into Waterworks District Number 3. Slide, please. Slide. These are the boundaries of the districts. The District 1 was primarily the eastern part of the parish. 2 was Ward 4, Grand Caillou, and the rest of the parish was Waterworks District Number 3. The city of Houma is a little small area that you see up there in the beginning. Now, part of the compromise and all this stuff was that they would leave areas around the city that weren't in a Waterworks District that the city could expand into when they got around to expanding. In 1964, 62, oh yes, the population in 62 was at 23,000 people in the parish. and there was increased need for a reliable source of raw water. So Mayor Conrad Piku had a committee approach the freshwater district, and again, after a lot of negotiations, they were rejected from joining. They tried to have 4 members on the board, and they were rejected, so we continued like we were. Slide. In 1964, the Homer Navigational Canal was completed, and saltwater intrusion increased. This is a recent reading on the saltwater content at the water intake structure at the city plant. The acceptable limit is 250 parts per million, which is about halfway up this line here. So you can see that for the greater part of the year, or almost half the year, you end up with water that just simply can't be used, or we have to find other sources. So we were still looking for a way to solve the problem. Senator Elner was approached, and he had the Corps of Engineers make a study on how to bring raw water to the City of Homer plant. They proposed a pump station at Bayou Lafourche near Raceland, and bringing water all the way from Raceland to the raw water into the plant, but it was entirely too expensive and really an unrealistic answer. We then contacted the state to see what kind of help we could get. And the state of Louisiana Department of Public Works made a study, and they concluded that the best source of raw water for the City of Homer plant was Lake Verret, and proposed that a flume be built from Lake Verret down to the City of Homer plant. Of course, building a flume all that distance would cost a fortune also. So the alternative to it, and the solution that was brought up, was to use Big Bayou Black. Intercoastal Canal connects to Big Bayou Black, which connects into the headwaters of the plant. The problem was there were 3 canals that tied into it: the Hanson, Miners, and Shell Canal. So it was proposed to put floodgates at those locations. Let me slide, please. These are the 3 canal locations here, there, and down here. Then from on this side on the Homer side of the Miners Canal, they dammed off the rest of Bayou Black to make that a reservoir. And the idea was that when the water was fresh and clear and no salt water was in, it could just flow naturally by itself, and the gates were left open. When the high water, and they would test the water regularly. And when the salt came up, they would close the gates and use the reservoir as a build. They put pumps there, and they put water into it. Slide, please. This is the floodgates, and this is the raw water pumps at Miners Canal that puts the water into Big Bayou Black. So the city then had 2 sources of raw water. One is the Bayou Black Reservoir, and the other one was the normal Intercoastal Canal intake, which was right near the mouth of the Homer Navigational Canal. In 1968, the parish was continuing to grow, and the district informed the city that they needed more capacity. They only had a small plant, and so the city went about building another 8 million gallon day plant. But they also told the water district they're going to have to find water somewhere else. This is a reservoir, and this is really sort of the original reservoir from the 1923 system, which was enlarged slightly. But it is used, they were using that in 1923 to go past the saltwater days, because there weren't that many saltwater days. So they had a reservoir that they would store water in, and they could use that for 2 or 3 or 4, maybe a week's time, and be able to get by operations until the salt subsided. They then built a new plant in '68. The Waterworks District was trying to find a source of water. So the idea came up, well, let's go buy water from Bayou Lafourche. They won't let us join it. Maybe they'll sell us some water. So the Waterworks District went to Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District, and they were able to negotiate a 40-year contract to buy water raw water and bring it into the plant, and they built their own plant. Slide, please. This is Bayou Lafourche, and this is the Lafort Canal. This drainage canal was built as a relief. This back here is the 40 Orpin Canal that fronts, it goes along the Bayou Lafourche area. And this was a relief canal to let water that built up back here get out to Bayou Lafourche. We basically turned this thing around, built a dam across, a weir across here at a pump station, and then we pump water through a pipeline into the water plant site. And this is where Terrebonne Parish, just over the parish line, built their first 8 million gallon plant. The city finished their 8 million gallon a day plant, and they served the southern part, District 2 and Ward 10, the southern part of the parish, and Water District Number 1 took over the northern part of the parish in its own regular limits. This is the plant today. It's 24 million gallons a day in capacity, and it has the ability to serve the entire parish when necessary. Slide. The city then contracted. The city had a relatively small operation, so the city contracted with Waterworks District Number 1 to operate their system for them. Then in November of '94, the city and the 3 districts consolidated into a consolidated district. Today, the consolidated district operates a 24 million gallon a day Shreva plant, the 8 million gallon a day city plant, 4 ground storage tanks, 2 3 million gallon standpipes, 16 elevated storage tanks, 915 miles of transmission line, varying in size from 4 inches to 36 inches, and we have 43,650 customers. That's pretty much the situation as far as the history of where that glass of water you got this morning came from. When the water came, the next question was, what about sanitation? Well, it really wasn't a problem in the early days. The primary method of sewage treatment and collection was the privy. There were some people in the city had indoor plumbing, but the water supply was the cisterns, and they were relatively limited as to what kind of capacities you could get for service. So this was how things started off. In 1930, the city population was about 7,000 people, and under the administration of Mayor Elwood Wright, the city constructed this first sanitary sewer collection system and treatment plant. The treatment plant was a Imhoff tank, which is a fairly model, an oversized septic tank almost, and it was built over on Doug Road off of Grand Caillou. If everybody all know where the disposal plant road is, that's where it got its name from. It was a disposal plant. After World War II, the oil and gas industry took off, and the community started to grow. The city administration, then the mayor was Mayor Leod Gary. His administration did not want to have the responsibility of building water systems and sewer systems. They just didn't want to do it. The first water system was the East Park Water Company. I'm going back to water now, but right inside the city of Houma, right, East Park Water Company went from New Orleans Avenue to the Intercoastal Canal and north of Bayou Terrebonne. So you can see it was almost in the middle of downtown Houma, there was no water. and therefore no sewers either. So what the first sewer district that was created was Crescent Park. And that was the area from Bayou La Carpe to the railroad track, go all the way to Little Bayou Black. That area, the back part of town. They formed sewer district number 1. And when they got that done, the city provided the sewage disposal and also the maintenance of the systems that were tied into the city. And once the system was built and the water lines were in, then the city would incorporate that into the city. When they expanded the when they recreated the Waterworks District, they let these areas out that the city could grow into. So that's basically what all these districts were formed around the city. Slide. Give you some idea. The districts were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 14. And as you can see, somewhere. Well, the white part in the middle was the city of Houma, and all the sewer districts were formed around it. Now, there was one strange district created, sewer district number 11. That's Country Club Drive on the side of the old Houma Golf Club. That sewer district was created for the express purpose of never providing sanitary sewers because the people didn't want to pay for it. So a special district was created just for them, and they control it, and they don't have sewers yet today. Slide. In 1956, the state approved the oxidation lagoon as a method of treatment. This allowed for areas outside the city to have reasonable sewage treatment available to them. So sewer district number 12 was formed, which was Broadmoor subdivision. As you can imagine, Madison Funderburk saw a good deal when he saw it. And he built Broadmoor subdivision. He had sewer district number 12 formed, and the first oxidation lagoon was built. Go back to the oxidation, yes. Well, there we go. This is 12 on the side here, and this is 13 that came later on. The two lagoons were next to each other. Slide. This is 12, slide. The area from Broadmoor down became sewer district number 13. And there was a big commotion, and they tried to put the whole thing in one sewer district, but the people fronting on Bayou Terrebonne who were dumping sewers out of their septic tank into Bayou Terrebonne objected to the formation of the district. So they were all left out. And to this day, they still don't have any sewers on Park and Main Street adjacent to Bayou Terrebonne. 1972, the Water Pollution Control Act was passed, and this gave us the opportunity to have sewers constructed for the entire parish. There was a GST engineering firm was formed that was Clifford Smith, our outfit, and Douglas Talbot. And as a joint venture, we were working to put together the facility plan required to get the grant for the whole program. In connection with that process, they required that a negative declaration be declared that the EPA had reviewed all the information and decided that there was no negative impact on the environment by building a sewer program. After the protest period was all over with and they were about to issue the letter, the Sierra Club filed a protest on the secondary effects of sewers. And I said, what the devil is that? The secondary effect of sewers was that it would encourage people to live in the wetlands or next to the wetlands, which could be a potential damage to the wetlands. So on that basis, EPA ordered that a full environmental impact study be prepared. It took 18 months to get the environmental study prepared and for it to be approved by EPA. And during that time, the priority of Terrebonne because Region 6 is about 15, 18 states, our priority dropped, and we were never able to get funding for the entire parish, which was envisioned in the beginning. And we would have had it if that protest had not been recognized by EPA. So that's how that particular thing ended up. So today, the parish did get funded the rehab of some of its sanitary sewer system. It got to build the north plant for 16 million gallons a day. It built the lagoons, the aerated lagoons for the city of Houma area, and it upgraded a number of pump stations. Slide. This is the lagoon, the city lagoon. It's aerated. This is an aerated chamber here, and these are 3 cells that we have. And all of this handles everything on the east side of the Intercoastal Canal. And the north plant is up by Broadmoor. This is the original 13 lagoon. The excess water during times of high flood, the rainwater goes into this pond until it can be processed by the plant itself. So this is the plant it exists at the present time. The parish has also consolidated all 24 districts. So we ended up being 24 districts altogether in Terrebonne Parish. So the parish formed a sewer department. We consolidated all of the districts, and they now operate that system. The last segment is the industrial water produced. I'll try to go through this quickly. The first one, of course, is the sugar industry. In 1794, Ian DeBoard was the first person to come up with granulated sugar from sugar cane. The first property sale in Terrebonne Parish for sugar cane property for raising a plantation was in 1821. In 1845, Robert Ridley, I think it is. Anyway, a gentleman invented the process that they use to refine sugar quicker and faster and better: vacuum pans and rollers, etc. In the late 1800s, there were about 100 sugar houses in Terrebonne Parish. Every plantation, every farm had their own sugar house. This is a typical sugar house. You can see it's a very small operation. Slide. By 1901, the sugar processing improved considerably, and they built larger plants so that there were all the small mills began to close. There were only 9 left after that. And these were the 9 plants that were left: Myrtle Grove, Ashland, Ellender, Arnard, Argyle, Womby, Southdown, and then Allendale had both a refinery and a mill. This was the lower one. This is the South Coast plant down in Montague. This was, at one time, this was the largest sugar refinery in the country. Slide. By 1972, there were only 2 refineries left. The South Coast one closed in that year. It had been in existence since 1883, and Southdown closed in 1977. And it went from the wastewater produced, it would get 265 gallons of wastewater produced per ton of cane processed. And the larger plants were producing about 1 million gallons a day of wastewater. And the passage of the Clean Water Act required them to do something to treat that wastewater. So Southdown built a oxidation lagoon, and South Coast closed up and moved out. The seafood industry, there was shrimping for a long time. The Indians were just catching shrimp, and the Frenchmen just caught shrimp also. But the seine net was developed, and they were mainly doing canning, and that started a shrimping industry. They could somehow or other can the shrimp. Then there was no refrigeration, So when the seining was going on, it had improved the catch. They went to sun-dried shrimp. These are the shrimp drying beds. This is in 1915 and 1968. You can see some of the shrimp drying beds, and we still have a blooming badger on and are still selling sun-dried shrimp from here. I don't know if it's sun-dried anymore. I think it's about my machine, but nonetheless. The big difference in Terrebonne for this was the Latrim shrimp peeling machine, but this takes an awful lot of water. And this was built it was patented in 1949, and that really began the shrimp season. Slide. It takes about 11,000 gallons of water to produce a ton of shrimp. They were getting about 100 million gallons of wastewater per season from here, and the wastewater is 5 to 6 times stronger than domestic waste. So it's quite a problem. Now, today, most of these plants have been bought out by Japanese company and moved to Barataria. Slide. Menhaden. The Menhaden, when it first started out, it was mainly used just for poultry feed. So it ran something like 5 metric tons a year from 1879 to 1940. And then from 1840, they started using it for poultry feed. So they were getting 40,000 tons a year. Then they started using it for omega-3. They were able to find out that it produced omega-3 oil, which had a high value, so the amount increased considerably. Zapata Haney had a plant that operated from 1967 to 1999, and they were able to use a oxidation lagoon at the end of their processing to process their water. So they were doing that towards the end before they closed down. Oil and gas industry, when they extract oil and gas out of the ground, oil field brine is released. And what they have been doing it is just either, in some instances, they re-inject it back into the ground, or they just release it onto the surface water. In Terrebonne, most of it got released into the surface water. In the study of that Carrie St. Pay was involved in, over 300 discharges were found in the Terrebonne Barataria estuary, producing 530,000 barrels a day of brine being released into the estuary. They found that the stuff was identified a half a mile from the discharge point, and it was elevated 3/4 of a mile from the discharge point. The high concentration of hydrocarbons detected to a depth of 10 to 12 inches. When you dug down into the soil out a good ways from the discharge points, you could find contamination going down into the soil a foot deep. Oyster contamination was found to be 1,200 feet from the discharge. So this was clearly a problem for our wetlands. These are locations that the borings, the soils were tapped, and this is the areas that were of influence around where the oil waste was located. Well, gentlemen, that completes the presentation that I have for you, and I hope that you've learned a little bit more about the water, sewers, and discharges into the waste.
Sure. All right, thank you, Mr. Arthur. Great presentation. I always said that people really don't worry about the faucet or the toilet until there's no water coming out or working on either one of those. So great presentation. So I will give the next presentation basically on environmental events that have affected Terrebonne Parish. A little background on myself. I'm a 1988 graduate of Nicholls State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology and a minor in chemistry. After graduation from Nicholls, I went to work for LDEQ in Lockport, and my boss was Kerry St. Pay. So as an environmental specialist, and later worked for the Terrebonne Parish Consolidated Government as an environmental specialist from 1994 to 2000. In 2006, I started Key Environmental Services, an environmental consulting firm, and since 2008, I've served as the director of the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness for Terrebonne Parish, first under Parish President Michelle Claude, and currently serve under the direction of our current Parish President, Gordon Dove. So just sitting here listening to Mr. Arthur's presentation, a lot of those water quality issues I had a chance to experience while I worked at the Department of Environmental Quality. So whenever you went to the sugar mill, a lot of the water was anaerobic, which means didn't have any oxygen in it, and it would produce a gas, kind of like a sulfur smell. And then same thing at the Menhaden plants. And I finally figured out that the reason I was going to the sugar mills and to the Menhaden's plant was because my boss, Kerry St. Pay, didn't want to go to those places. So, I learned quite a bit during my time with the DEQ on water quality issues, especially in this area, and those that affect the oil industry and the seafood industry as a whole. So, we'll go ahead and begin my presentation. I'm going to go over four different aspects of environmental events. One is the invasive species that have been found in Terrebonne Parish, not all of them, but those that are a major issue. I'll talk about the major hurricanes that have affected Terrebonne Parish, some of the major oil spills that have affected our parish, our timber industry and our oyster industry, some of the environmental effects that are a concern for those industries. Oh, let's see. I think he stole it. Okay. Invasive species threaten not only Louisiana's economy and environment, but it's also a unique cultural identity in America, one based on our bayous and back swamps, our rich history and famous cuisine, and our core industries. In recent years, aquatic plants from around the world, such as hydrilla, water hyacinth, and salvinia, have clogged the waterways that make Louisiana a sportsman's paradise. The five invasive species I will present on tonight are the water hyacinths. Most people will refer to that as a water lily. The nutria, something that's fairly new to our area, is an apple snail. Then I will speak about the giant salvinia that's clogging up our bayous. And then the Chinese tallow tree. Most of us remember these as small kids because we'll take the China balls, put them in our slingshots, and shoot everybody with them. Okay. All right. Everybody's familiar with this little creature here, the nutria. The scientific name is Myocasta coipus. It originated from South America in the late 1930s. It was deliberately introduced in our area for the fur industry. It accidentally escaped captivity in 1937. Some stories are that the Macohennies with the Tabasco plant had brought those in, and during a hurricane they escaped due to the wind damage to their kennels, or where they were living. Their preferred habitat are marshes and swamps. We have lots of nutria eat-outs. This is where the nutria is eating out the marsh areas. They damage about 100,000 acres of coastal wetlands in Louisiana, and they making them more vulnerable than erosion in our parish. Muskrats have been crowded out by the nutria, and they are looking at making the nutria as a possible dog food material, and so there was a company formed by the name of Marsh Dog that was going to make dog food out of the carcasses. Oops. Okay, the muskrat, let me back up here. The muskrat, once trapped for their valuable fur throughout the Cajun country, have been crowded out by the nutria. Let me back up here. And then from places like China, Brazil, and South Pacific, these species are introduced to Louisiana. And then other species that have been introduced, have evolved from plant species and other animal species. Nutria are large herbivores. They're aquatic rodents brought to Louisiana, as I said, from Brazil in the early 20th century for fur forming. Nutria typically feed on the roots of semi-aquatic and aquatic vegetation. This leads to the loss of the vegetative cover, which in turn leaves the denuded substrate subject to erosion. The end result of this process is the conversion of marsh to open water. Interesting fact is that the nutria breed year-round and are extremely prolific. Males reach sexual maturity between 4 and 9 months, whereas females reach sexual maturity between 3 and 9 months. Sexual maturity may vary with habitat quantity, and then with a gestation period of only 130 days, in 1 year, an adult nutria can produce 2 liters and be pregnant for a third. The number of young in the litter ranges from 1 to 13 with an average of 4.5, and the females can breed within a day of having a litter. Litter size can vary with age of the female, habitat quality, and the time of year. The young nutria at birth are fully furred and the eyes are open, and newborn nutria start feeding on vegetation within hours and will nurse for 7 to 8 weeks. So with the nutria issue that has occurred in our parish and throughout the state has instituted what they call the Coastwide Nutria Control Program. It was established in 2002 to combat nutria in coastal Louisiana. The goal of the program was to remove up to 400,000 nutria each season from coastal Louisiana to reduce marsh damage. The overgrazing by nutria removes the vegetation from the surface of the marsh, once again results in the very fragile organic soils becoming exposed to erosion through tidal action. If damaged areas do not revegetate quickly, they will become open water as tidal scour removes soil and thus lowers the elevation. Frequently, nutria grazing damages the plant's root systems, making recovery through vegetative generation very slow. So in 2020, 2021, the Nutria Control Program, they captured or turned in the hunters 312,118 nutria tails worth about $1.8 million in incentive payments. So right now they pay a bounty of $6 per nutria tail to hunters and trappers. And the program runs from November 20th through March 31st. Plaquemines Parish turned in the most tails, 62,617, followed by us here in Terrebonne with 60,750 tails, and then St. Mary. The fewest tails turned in by a participant was 11, but the greatest number turned in, which was a group of commercial fishermen, was 27,209 tails. So 35% of the total registered participants turned in more than 800 tails. So the average is, 800 tails per person. 58% of the nutria were harvested by a rifle, and 17% were trapped, and the rest were shot with a shotgun. In 2021, they did a nutria herbivory survey. In May of 2021, there were 2,250 acres damaged along certain transect lines, which extrapolated throughout the coast of about 8,436 acres destroyed by nutria. So the damages by parish, 4 parishes was observed to have damage in 2021. Most of the observed damage occurred here in Terrebonne Parish with 1,719 acres, over 19 sites, followed by St. Mary, Cameron, and St. Charles Parish. And here's some pictures showing, how a nutria can cause damage to the the marsh. Here you can see this has been eaten out by the nutria. They haven't got to this portion yet, so you see how it's a little higher. This is nutria eat out in a marsh area. You can see how much of the vegetation has been damaged. Typically when this occurs, this will subside and it'll turn into open water. This is a close-up of a severely damaged brackish marsh, a saltwater marsh inside of our estuary, just not fresh water. Once again, you can see the vegetation eat out due to the nutrient. This is interesting. So in some of these areas where they're researching the eat out, they'll put a cage in the middle of the marsh so that the nutria cannot get inside of that area. And so you can see how much the nutria eats all of this area. It cannot get into this box. So you can see how strong and vibrant the marsh is inside of that box. Okay. Apple snails were first sighted in Gretna. All of you have seen these on the side of the road recently. These are those pink-looking eggs that you see on vegetation, usually above the water line. They were first sighted in Gretna in 2006 and were first reported in Terrebonne in the Chacahula Swamp. So they native to South America, and they were first reported in the 1970s in Texas. They have since spread throughout southeast Louisiana, much larger size than our native snails, and can outcompete our native species for resources. They can cause habitat degradation by consuming large quantities of aquatic vegetation. They were introduced accidentally or intentionally from private aquariums. People would have these snails in their aquariums. They get too big. They want to get rid of them. They take them out and they'll throw them in the ditch in their front yard or the bayou behind them. And so then they start populating. They serve as a host to the rat lungworm, which has been shown to infect humans and other mammals. And currently, Louisiana regulations prohibit the possession of live apple snails. According to Todd Miller with the Louisiana Ag Center, apple snails are affecting crawfish farms at the present time by clogging up the crawfish traps and eating the bait. Production losses of up to 50% have been seen in some ponds across the state. Each apple snail mass can contain hundreds of eggs, with a female producing them every week to 10 days in the summer months. They eat native submerged aquatic vegetation, eliminating food and habitat for ducks and other species, while also helping invasive aquatic plant species by removing the competition. In the egg stage, they emit toxins that can irritate human skin, and the adults carry, once again, the rat lungworm, which is a parasite that can affect humans through consumption of raw or undercooked snail meat or contaminated produce that has been touched by the snail. Most cases are mild and people fully recover, but severe cases can cause chronic nerve damage or even death. No human cases have been identified in Louisiana. In March of 2020, the Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry reported the apple snails wiped out a 50-acre field of rice, making the first reported case of the snail damaging crops in Louisiana. You can see the snails on the side of this boat, this crawfish harvesting boat. One of the issues with this is if he pulls this boat up out of his pond and moves it to another pond, he's now brought those apple snails from his pond to another pond. We see this a lot with invasive species, especially vegetative invasive species. We go pick up our boats and we back them into the water and we pick up some of those invasive species as we pulling up the boat, and then we drive down and go to the next boat launch and we launch it. And so we bring in that invasive species to other parts of our area, or even to another parish, or even to another state. Okay. Next is water hyacinths. We're all familiar with these. We've seen them clogging up our bayous. Once again, they originated in South America in 1884. It seems like everything is coming from South America. They escaped into our waterways from our nurseries and ornamental ponds. People liked them, thought they were nice, put them in their ponds. They overgrow their pond or their little water feature. They take them out, throw them in the bayou or the ditch. They were deliberately released into Louisiana environment being used as an ornamental for the 1884 World's Industrial and Cotton Expedition in New Orleans. The preferred habitat, once again, is the wetlands and calm waterways. They create breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and water hyacinth mats may double in size within 1 to 2 weeks. They clog our bayous and canals. They impede our boat traffic. They slow our water currents. They block sunlight to native submerged aquatic vegetation, which degrades the water quality and harms the wildlife in those areas. The decomposition of these water hyacinths lowers dissolved oxygen levels, thus negatively impacts aquatic wildlife. Been on a couple of fish kills where the water hyacinths were sprayed. Usually the herbicide that they would use, it actually speeds up the growth of the top part of the plant, which then what happens is the roots don't have enough roots to survive that large plant, so the plant eventually dies. So you have these large mats of dead vegetation in some of these bayous, especially closed-in bayous. As the degradation of that material begins, it starts taking the oxygen out of the water, what we call dissolved oxygen, and it will cause fish kills in these closed-in canals, especially during the hot periods of the year. The native fauna and all native freshwater communities are negatively impacted by the water hyacinths. Additionally, the species that require a substantial open water habitat component are negatively impacted by the dense mass that they form. For instance, like ducks trying to land in a pond. If they're covered with the hydrilla, there's no place for them to land inside the pond. So it negatively impacts those wildlife that need open water habitats. Okay. This is a map showing just about where you can find water hyacinths in the state of Louisiana, pretty much the whole state except for the very northern part of the state. I'm not sure when this map, 2003. I would bet if you looked hard enough, you would find some up there. Okay. The next invasive species is giant salvinia. It's originated from Brazil in 1998, lives in waterways and found in ornamental ponds and aquariums. Once again, deliberate introduction and followed by accidental spread. The deliberate introduction is people use these in their ornamental ponds, have too many of them, take them out, once again, throw them in the bayou. And then the accidental spread would be from, transferring your boat from one place to another. It's found in slow-moving freshwaters. A report from Michael Massimi, he's the invasive species coordinator with the Barataria National Estuary Program, stated that the invasive floating fern giant salvinia is possibly the most noxious of all aquatic weeds. It is native to southern Brazil, where ironically it is not particularly abundant or troublesome. Freed from the natural systems of checks and balances in its native range, however, giant salvinia has become one of the world's most destructive invaders. Introduced and spread mainly as an ornamental by horticulture and pond garden trade, it has become established in tropical and subtropical regions on 4 continents. In the U.S., giant salvinia is established in at least 11 states, and if current trends hold, it has the potential to devastate freshwater habitats in as many as 20 states. In Louisiana, the giant salvinia first became established in the Toledo Bend Reservoir in 1998. By 2004, it had spread to Terrebonne, Cameron, Lafourche, Jefferson Davis, and Lafourche parishes. Then came the hurricane season of 2005. While salty storm surge from Hurricane Rita apparently helped wipe out the infestation in Cameron Parish, Katrina did no such favors in the southeastern portion of the state. The widespread flooding and high winds had the opposite effect. Giant salvinia was soon found in the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, where it then was able to spread into many water bodies throughout the coastal zone. Boating activity no doubt contributed to the accelerated spread, both along the coast and the lakes of northern Louisiana. Giant salvinia is currently considered established in at least 15 parishes, mostly in the southeast and northwest of the state, and the river flooding of 2011 resulted in additional introductions. The growth rate of giant salvinia is exponential. It doubles its coverage area in as little as a week under good growing conditions. A single plant could cover 40 square miles in 3 months. A single plant, that is many plants in that picture. So if you, one small plant is take this little area right here, this little bunch right here, okay? 40 square miles in 3 months. Waters infested with giant salvinia quickly become covered by a thick mat of vegetation. The mat can be up to 3 feet thick at the surface, making navigation impossible even for relatively large boats. The mat is so much denser than other floating plants, blocking sunlight almost completely and greatly inhibiting the oxygen exchange at the surface. The decay of the plant further deoxygenizes the water. The result is catastrophic for native flora and fauna. Once again, the hypoxic waters can cause fish kills. Submerged native aquatic plants are shaded out and they die. Habitat is destroyed for air-breathing animals like otters, diving birds, turtles, and frogs, which cannot penetrate the mat. Ducks, which relish surfaces covered with the much thinner native duckweed, will completely avoid surfaces covered with salvinia. There is also evidence that prolonged presence of salvinia mats can cause gradual acidification of lakes and ponds. They have human impacts too. Water management structures are damaged or rendered useless. Boating and commercial navigation is impeded. Intakes from municipal drinking water or industrial facilities are clogged, and recreational uses such as fishing, waterfowl hunting, paddling, and swimming are pretty much stopped. Currently, there is a promise with a biological control. A small South American insect known as the Salvinia weevil has been approved for use by the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. The Salvinia weevil appears to be completely host-specific, meaning that it cannot survive on plants other than the Salvinia. It is thus an ideal biocontrol agent. It feeds primarily on the buds, but also the leaves of the plant. Its larvae hatch on the plant and feed on the buds and rhizomes. Plants develop brown lesions at the feeding sites that quickly grow and merge. Entire mats can brown over and the plants die and sink. Under the right conditions, Salvinia weevils can be extremely effective at controlling giant Salvinia. Okay, this is the Chinese tallow tree, also known as a chicken tree or a popcorn tree. It is one of our most serious invasive species of mesic in wet forests and grasslands. Originated from China around 1772. That's why I guess it's called the Chinese tallow tree. Escaped into our natural ecosystem from nurseries. It was deliberately introduced as an ornamental, first introduced by none other than Benjamin Franklin. He's done a lot of good things for us, but this wasn't one of them. Preferred habitat is the forested areas and swamp edges. They crowd out our native plants, and a single Chinese tallow tree can produce 100,000 seeds in a year, which can spread to surrounding areas by birds, water, and wind. So as a child, like I said, we had one of these in our front yard. I didn't know it was an invasive species, but it was nice to have the China balls for the slingshot. I didn't know I had 100,000 of those, though. Okay. All right. Now we'll turn to hurricanes that have affected Terrebonne Parish. There's been 3 major hurricanes that I'll discuss. One is the Alderneers Last Island hurricane in 1856, the 1965 Hurricane Betsy, and just recently in 2021 Hurricane Ida. There have been other hurricanes that have affected our parish, but not as great as these. In our time, if I had to guess, there's probably well over 50 hurricanes that have affected, or more, that have affected our parish from a Category 1 all the way through a Category 4 hurricane. Numerous hurricanes and tropical storms have impacted our environment. Impacts have included erosion. Mr. St. Pé identified those 2 areas of 206 square miles for Katrina Rita and another 106 square miles for Ida. That's only 2 hurricanes that we have data for of losing our marshlands. due to hurricanes. And like I've said, we've had many hurricanes traverse through Terrebonne Parish. They have affected our barrier islands and shorelines. We've had saltwater intrusion from storm surges. We've had illicit sewer discharges from industry and private sewer plants located in Terrebonne Parish, especially during flooding that is caused by these hurricanes. And we've had some minor oil spills within our estuaries due to hurricanes affecting Terrebonne Parish. 2 of the 3 strongest hurricanes to make landfall in Louisiana impacted Terrebonne Parish: Hurricane Ida and the 1856 Isle Deniers hurricane. The other major hurricane that impacted Terrebonne Parish was Hurricane Betsy in 1965. It's just not listed as one of the 3 strongest hurricanes. Hurricane Ida. Hurricane Ida was a strong Cat 4 hurricane that we experienced last year. Packed a punch when coming on shore at Port Fourchon with winds of about 150 miles per hour and life-threatening storm surges of about 16 feet in the Grand Isle area. The storm was a tropical depression down here on the 26th of August. And then within 3 days, it was a major Category 4 hurricane with the lowest pressure recorded of 929 millibars. On land, it was recorded at 931, which is not a big difference. The reason I wanted to show this slide is with climate change and the warming of our Gulf waters, we can expect to see these fast developing and intensifying hurricanes as more and more common within the next years. We used to say we had 5 days basically to start preparing for a hurricane. Now we're looking at 3 days or less based on the intensity that the warm waters of the Gulf are providing. 2 boats for Hurricane Ida were moored at Port Fourchon. They reported instantaneous wind gusts of 194 knots and 150 knots as Ida passed over Port Fourchon. Those instruments were not used by the National Hurricane Center to determine whether or not it was a Cat 4 or a Cat 5. Based on the instruments do not do sustained wind calculations, which means that most of these instruments have to measure wind for at least either 1 minute or 2 minute intervals in order to be used within the National Hurricane Center reports. The storm surge in Grand Isle was between 9.2 feet and 10.2 feet. The Weather Service predicted somewhere between 9 and 11 feet. The Terrebonne peak inundation from the storm surge was about 3 to 6 feet above the ground level. Most of that surge occurred outside of our Morganza to the Gulf hurricane protection levee. But there was a reverse storm surge from hurricane force winds from the north that battered Terrebonne Parish for anywhere between 6 to 10 hours, which caused 16 to 18 feet waves near the Bubba Dove floodgate at the Homer Navigation Canal. So we do have documentation from video from the Bubba Dove floodgate, which shows that the north wind was pushing the water from the Homer Navigation Canal, and it was pushing waves pretty much over the Bubba Dove floodgate, which is, once it's set in the water, it is about 18 feet high. So we do have documentation that shows that. There was also a reverse storm surge of approximately 9 feet that was observed against the Bayou Petit Caillou floodgate. So once again, the northern winds pushed the water down Bayou Petit Caillou, pushed it up against the floodgate in Bayou Petit Caillou, and as the water kept pushing and building up, it got to about a height of about 9 feet in that area. Ida caused severe to catastrophic damage to Terrebonne Parish and other parishes in southeast Louisiana, and substantial damage in portions of the northeastern United States, which a lot of us did not know or weren't concerned because of the amount of damage that we had here. The National Centers for Environmental Information estimated that Ida's winds, rains, and storm surges and tornadoes caused a total of $75 billion in damages within the United States. About $55 billion of those damages were in Louisiana. Every household in Terrebonne Parish was impacted by Ida, either through damage to their homes or damage to their businesses or places of work, or being without water and electricity for an extended period of time. Some areas in Terrebonne Parish were without electricity for a little over 30 days after Hurricane Ida. Okay. The next hurricane I want to talk about is the 1856. I'll tell you what, we're going to save that one. Let's see if I can get the, whoops. I thought I had a Betsy slide in here, but I don't. Okay. We'll talk about Hurricane Betsy. Betsy was a Category 3 storm when it made landfall in Grand Isle and again in Terrebonne Parish on September 9th, 1965, 57 years ago, with wind gusts measured at 145 miles an hour and sustained winds exceeding 110 miles an hour. It left nothing more than foundations and debris in Grand Isle, and wind speeds in Terrebonne Parish had reportedly reached 165 mile per hour gusts. One thing we need to remember between now and 1965, which was 57 years ago, we have lost a lot of our coastline. Okay, we have lost a lot of our barrier islands that protect us from these storms. We have lost a lot of our marsh due to subsidence and other issues. That is no longer there and that no longer protects us from the storm surge and of these storms. So fortunately, we now have a Morgantic levee system, that a 75-mile levee system that extends through the southern part of Terrebonne Parish that keeps out a majority of the storm surges from smaller storms that affect our parish. Almost 16 feet of water affected Grand Isle for Betsy, destroying or damaging every building, and the fishing villages of Delacroix Island and Yatloski were swept away in their entirety by floodwaters. Sugarcane, cotton, and pecan crops were devastated over a wide region, and thousands of livestock drowned. Hundreds of ships, barges, and oil field facilities were sunk or damaged. As reported by the local newspaper at the time, the Terrebonne Press, damages seen in Terrebonne Parish was mostly from hurricane-force winds that shredded trailer homes, unroofed traditional buildings, and played havoc with trees and power lines. Terrebonne Parish had minimal flooding from Hurricane Betsy compared to the city of New Orleans and other areas east of Terrebonne Parish. So the headline on the September 14, 1965 Terrebonne Press indicated it was too early to estimate cane crop damage. Betsy's damages to sugarcane crops in Terrebonne Parish are more severe than those dealt by Hurricane Hilda, was the consensus of opinions, although many said it was far too early to make a fair estimate as to the amounts. Hilda struck in October, much nearer the harvest time, and all cane for the coming season had been planted. Such was not the case for Hurricane Betsy, and the acreage might be much smaller next year because of this. Roland Toops of South Coast Corporation noted that there are two schools of thoughts. One, that the early storm may be much better than a later one, and two, that the early storm will make the crop impossible to harvest. Avi Weiss, the school board member and former of Ward 10 in Dularge, said that the most damages will come from the farmers not having to get the cane out of their fields, whether they can sell it or not. Other stories told how 17 of the 33 schools operated by the school board were still closed more than a week after the storm because of having no electricity in most cases. Moderate roof damages were suffered by some of the schools in operation, but there was no cause for alarm or danger to any students. South Terrebonne High School, one of the newest and largest schools in the parish, apparently suffered the heaviest damages, and no estimate of opening time was available by press time. This is exactly what occurred also during Hurricane Ida. South Terrebonne High School is one of the most damaged schools in our school system. Betsy's effects on outdoor sports was mentioned in the Steve Kinney Jr. Setting the Hook column, published on September 17th. He says, boy, what a mess. There is general agreement that damages to all outdoor life has been severe and may have long-lasting effects. There were also tremendous losses suffered by owners of fishing and hunting camps throughout the parish. Many recently finished rebuilding camps destroyed by Hurricane Hilda last September. So there was quite a bit of damage due to Hurricane Betsy. We did not have the flooding that occurred in New Orleans. Once again, we were on the west side of the storm, and most of the parish was being affected with a north wind coming through the parish. So that eliminated some of the flooding that could have occurred. So I'm going to move on now to the 1856 last island hurricane. One thing I want to mention here, Mr. St. Pé showed a map of 1806 of our coastline. If you look very closely down at the southern port of Terrebonne, you can see that we were still connected to some of our barrier islands, and that you could drive to our barrier islands back in that time. So there was an article published by Mr. David Roth, who worked for the National Weather Service, entitled Louisiana Hurricane History. August 10th through 12, 1856, the hurricane strikes Isle Denier's last island, a pleasure resort southwest of New Orleans. The highest points were under 5 feet of water. The resort hotel was destroyed along with the island's gambling establishments. Over 200 people perished, and the island was left void of vegetation and split in half. Only one terrified cow remained on the island after the catastrophe. Last Island is now only a haven for pelicans and other seabirds. It's also stated that on the night of August 10th, 1856, a powerful hurricane struck Last Island off the tip of Terrebonne Parish. The sea rose in the darkness and trapped hundreds of summer vacationers visiting the popular resort. Wind-driven waves 8 feet high raked the island and tore it in two. By morning, everything standing upright was broken, splintered, and washed away, including all of the island's trees, its casinos, a hotel, and the summer homes of wealthy New Orleans families. More than 200 people died. Many were crushed, and others drowned after being struck by wreckage in the devastation. Okay. Let me back up. Oops, on the wrong way. Okay. I want to read this article to you guys, and it's kind of lengthy, but it's very descriptive of what took place on Isle Denier's during that hurricane. It was written by Eric Trickey with the Smithsonian Magazine in 2017. They danced carefree in the resort's hotel ballrooms, hundreds of men and women from New Orleans and across Louisiana, stepping through a quadrille contrivance to the music of an old German fiddler. Now and then, they felt a tremor in the floor as wind and rain battered the hotel in ever stronger gusts. The memory of the fiddler's music would be tinged with melancholy for one of the ballgoers. By the next night, half of the dancers would be dead. More than 160 years ago, on Sunday, August 10th, 1856, a hurricane tore port a Louisiana island, destroying nearly every building on it and killing 200 people. The aptly named Isle Denier, French for Last Island, was Louisiana's southernmost outpost of civilization, home to a resort town popular for its cool breezes until the unnamed hurricane erased it. About 200 others, white and black, escaped the hurricane's destruction. What's left of Isle Denier's has never been inhabited again. The disaster holds a prominent place in Louisiana history, but its story adds up to much more than that. The permanent destruction of an American coastal town stands as a warning today for communities in Louisiana and beyond in peril from climate change, extreme storms, and rising seas. Isle Denier, 24 miles long and at points a mere mile wide, lay 5 miles south of Louisiana mainland in the Gulf of Mexico, southwest of New Orleans off Terrebonne Parish. A mix of beaches, dunes, and marsh, it stood about 5 feet above sea level. In the 1840s, wealthy Louisianans built the first of 100 summer homes on the island. Visitors came by steamboat to swim in the sea, paddle out on excursion boats, walk the beaches, explore the islands by horse and carriage, and twirl on a carousel. Mugger's Hotel, the largest structure on the island, included a restaurant and ballroom and offered bowling and billiards. Isle Denier was advertised as a summer resort, and it's unlikely that anyone lived there year-round. Few celebrants on Isle Denier, the day it was destroyed, had contemplated the dangers of summering on a remote barrier island during hurricane season. Having been at the island for so many seasons and in all kinds of weather, I felt no apprehension, wrote sugar planter Michael Slater, who owned a home there. He wasn't the only person who was unconcerned about the island. That summer, the Muggers were negotiating with investors to build a new, larger hotel there. The first warning signs appeared on Friday evening, August 8th. Toward night, the water assumed an angry appearance, and the waves on the Gulf were quite high, recalled W. W. Pugh, Speaker of the Louisiana House of Representatives, who was on the island that weekend. By Saturday, Isle Denier's marshes were submerged, and the cattle on the island were pacing and lowering. The storm grew to gale force. The Star, a steamboat ferry headed toward the island, lost its bearings in the storm, and by Sunday morning, the crew debated whether to turn back to its mainland port. But Captain Abram Smith, concerned about the fate of those left on the island, insisted on returning amid the hurricane, a decision that saved many lives. The never-named hurricane hit Isle Deniers with full force at about 3 p.m. By then, it was the equivalent of a Category 4 hurricane with winds up to 150 miles per hour. It seemed all the aerial currents in creation had been turned upon us, recalled Reverend R.S. McAllister of Thibodaux, Louisiana. Fiery lightning almost constantly illuminated the heavens. The Gulf upon one side of the bay, upon the other, were advancing upon us. Sugar planter Thomas Mill, slaves fled their timber shack as he began to blow a port, and they ran to Mill's house. One slave, Richard, tried to convince Mill to move his family and slaves into a stable built with sturdy, deeply driven pylons. Mill refused. Houses shook, slid down the beach, lost their roofs, and tore apart. Many residents raced for the hotel, hoping for refuge, but it too was blown to pieces. The exposed men and women began to perish, bludgeoned by flying debris or drowned as a 13-foot storm surge inundated the island. Remember, the island was only 5 feet high. Okay, so survivors outlasted the storm by clinging to anything they could. Reverend McAllister and 11 others raced to a carousel and hung onto it all night as it spun in the wind. Many refugees from the hotel, including Pugh, took refuge behind its cistern. Though the Star's top decks were ripped off, its hull stayed afloat and provided cover for 160 people. Slater watched most of his family drown, but saved himself by crawling onto a large piece of wooden debris with his Mill, his neighbor, and fellow planter. They rode it as a raft, and the current carried them 5 miles to the mainland before straining them in a marsh. Mill's slave Richard hid out in the stable, the only building the storm did not level. Emma Mill, the planter's 18-year-old daughter, was one of several survivors who grabbed pieces of wood as they were swept out to sea, then held on until the storm shifted and cast them back into the island. Excuse me. Eyes of water. The next morning, survivors wandered Isle Denier, surrounded by the dead. The jeweled and lily hand of a woman was seen protruding from the sand. All of the island's homes were gone, even the foundations. Richard found Emma on the beach, deeply wounded, and brought her to Alfred de Perrier, a doctor who had survived the storm by tying himself to an armoire and floating on it for 20 hours. While treating her for her injuries, a 30-year-old widower felt a bond grow between them. They married that December. A saloon keeper and a crewman from the store found a sailboat that could still float and set out for the mainland. Arriving in Brashear City, which is now Morgan City, they alerted the crew of a steamer which arrived at Isle Denier to rescue the survivors 3 days after the storm. Slater and Thomas Mill were rescued by a passing ship 5 days after the hurricane, though Mill, starved and dehydrated, died 2 days later. Aldenier, split in two by the hurricane's waters, was never inhabited again. Later storms eroded it further, and by 1988, 70% of its former landmass was submerged. Today, it remains formed the Aldenier's chain, which is 5 islands, 3 of which make up Louisiana's Terrebonne Barrier Island Refuge, which is home to nesting water birds. The boundary between land and sea is never fixed in Louisiana. Last year, floods near Baton Rouge, which was in 2016, reminded the nation that the danger of losing entire communities to storms and floods is ever present. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina wiped out most of the uninhabited Chandelier Islands. Holly Beach, a tiny Louisiana town known as the Cajun Riviera, has been leveled by hurricanes 3 times, most recently by Rita in 2005 and Ike in 2008, and it was also affected by Hurricane Laura in 2020. And this year, the last 27 families on Louisiana's Isle de Jean Charles, members of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe, agreed to become the nation's first community to relocate due to climate change. The Aldeniers, once a single island, are the canaries in the mine shaft, argued Abby Salinger in Island in a Storm. In his 2009 book on the disaster, Their demise warning us of what may happen along our coast in a warmer world. Very descriptive detail of what went on. I'm sorry, I'm not crying. My eyes are watering from reading so much. But very descriptive of what happened. And I wanted to leave this picture up here so as I was reading, you can see what was there on this island. We were 1822. We became a parish. This wasn't but 34 years after we became a parish that this had occurred within our parish. Let's see. Lost my pointer here. Okay. All right, we're going to move on now to major spills in Terrebonne Parish. 2 of the major spills in Terrebonne Parish was the Lake Barre Texaco pipeline spill and all that occurred in 1997, and the BP oil spill, which we're all familiar, that occurred in 2010. A discovery of oil in Jennings in 1901 launched the commercial oil exploration in Louisiana. In 1921, the state of Louisiana issued the first coastal zone oil lease, and land development companies began acquiring huge tracts of swampland. Louisiana Land and Exploration Company, organized in 1926 as a Maryland corporation and responsible for exploring over half of Louisiana's 2 million available acres by 1928, entered into a contract with the Texas Company, which later became Texaco, guaranteeing the latter an exclusive right to prospect, drill for, and produce oil, gas, and sulfur on its properties in Louisiana. Petroleum exploration and production continued through the Great Depression, and by the latter part of the 1930s, companies marched steadily through the Terrebonne swamps, with early activity being highly ecologically disruptive. In 1952, the Terrebonne Company laid the first pipeline in the region. Pipeline became the primary mode of transport. Pipeline canals required significant dredging. Many of these pipeline canals have provided saltwater access to many of our freshwater areas. 2 major oil spills that affected Terrebonne Parish was the Texaco pipeline spill in Lake Barre in 1997 and the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. This is a picture showing the oil and gas extraction infrastructure off the coast of Louisiana. All the lines in the water are typically pipelines. The structures you see along the coastline are typically where most of your oil wells or some type of oil and gas pipeline structure may be located. Okay, one of the issues we have with our pipelines in Terrebonne Parish is due to subsidence of our marshes. The pipelines that used to pass underneath that marsh are now exposed to open water. So loss of coastal wetlands is exposing once buried pipelines. So in this, you can see where the original marsh line is. Let's get this to work. Okay, the colored tree-looking thing was the original marsh edge. The pipeline, all of that used to have marsh covering the pipeline in the top part of that picture. And then you can see where the current marsh edge is, and that the pipeline is exposed. Typically, the only thing marking these pipelines is a structure. It's supposed to be a sign saying there's a pipeline under this area. Okay. The Lake Barre oil spill occurred on May 16th in 1997 at 4 p.m. The operator of the pipeline noticed pressure drop in the pipeline, shut in the pipeline. They immediately began exploring why they had a pressure drop in the pipeline. Come to find out, there was a 16-inch crude oil transmission line that was owned by the Texaco Pipeline Company that had ruptured approximately 27 miles southeast of Houma. There were 6,561 barrels, about 275,562 gallons of crude oil released. There have been some estimates that there was at least 10,000 barrels released during that spill. 4,327 acres of saltwater marsh were exposed to petroleum hydrocarbons, which was more than the BP oil spill in 2010 for Terrebonne Parish. So more marsh was affected from the Lake Barre oil spill in 1997 than the BP oil spill for Terrebonne Parish in 2010. A precautionary oyster harvesting closure was in effect from August 1st, 1997, through August 1st, 1997, which was 74 days, and an area of 94 square miles were closed to oyster fishing. The trustees, which are individuals from different federal and state and local agencies, estimated approximately 16,423 pounds of fish, crab, and shrimp were lost due to that particular spill. And Texaco estimated approximately 100 birds were killed. Okay, here's some pictures of that oil spill. You can see the black material up against the Barry Island there, and then you see how it's been boomed off, and then oil was collected in booms on the north side with some skimming going on during that process. Once again, here's another picture of oil affecting the coastline. You can see not all of it's dark oil, but there is a lot of sheen being produced from this particular spill, which still affects the environment in these areas. The total, let's see, here's some more pictures of sheen and oil in the marshes along Terrebonne Parish. And then this kind of gives you an idea of where it occurred. You can see where the pipeline is. That's that straight line on the right side. Due to the southeast winds, the southwest winds, it pushed most of the oil into Lake Barre up against the Terrebonne coastline. All right. That particular spill cleanup cost Texaco back in 1997 $9.8 million to clean up. They were also required to do a natural resource damage assessment, which was one of the first natural resource damage assessments conducted in the United States, which was here in Terrebonne Parish. Okay. Next is our BP oil spill. The spill began on April 20th in 2010. With the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, 11 people died in that explosion. 17 were injured, and another 100 or so survived that particular spill. There was almost 200 people on that platform during that explosion. The spill was capped on July 15th, 2010. 87 days of gushing oil through that well. Estimates of 35,000 to 60,000 barrels of crude oil flowed from the well per day, covering 2,500 square miles. Greater than 200 million gallons of oil spilled. It was the largest spill in U.S. history. approximately a little more than 1.8 million gallons of dispersants were used at depth, which means that it was actually pumped into the well and on the surface waters of the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of questions were brought up about why they wanted to use that dispersant. Typically what that dispersant did was help the oil emulsify. Believe it or not, it would allow the oil to sink within the water column, and at that point, the naturally occurring bacteria that's in the Gulf of Mexico could break down the oil a lot quicker. And the other major decision made to use dispersants was we did not want that oil in our marshes along the coast of Louisiana. It's a lot easier and less damage environmentally to keep the water in open, the oil in open water, and to allow it to hit our coastline. Major impacts of Terrebonne Parish were the closing of fisheries habitat for an extended period of time, and the moratorium placed on any new drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, which affected many businesses in Terrebonne Parish and other Gulf Coast states. The closure of the fishing industry was a huge economic impact to Terrebonne Parish. The marsh and barrier island impacts were noted within Terrebonne Parish with oil sheens and tar balls, and the cleanup and monitoring of our coastal areas continued for several years. This is the area that was closed. You can see the pink area on the left is what was closed below Terrebonne Parish. Typically, everything south of Terrebonne Parish was closed to any type of fisheries. And then we had the closure in the Plaquemine, St. Bernard, Mississippi Sound area. This is a picture showing the extent of oiling from the BP oil spill provided by the Barra National Estuary Program. This was in July 7th of 2010, so a couple months after the spill. The areas that are in red were heavily impacted by oil. Orange was moderate, and the yellow was light. If you look in our area where Terrebonne is associated to the left of the map, you can see we didn't have that many reds, okay? But we did have some oranges and some yellows that impacted our areas along in Terrebonne Parish. This was produced in September 1st, but a few months after the spill, you can see down in Terrebonne Parish, except for our barrier islands, we were pretty much no oil was observed except for a small portion up on the right-hand side of our coastline, and then our barrier islands had some light oiling with one area that had some heavy oiling in that area. These are some of the barrier island impacts that were noted. Some of the sandy beaches had oil on top of them. These are not pictures from Terrebonne Parish, but I just wanted you to see some of the damages that was caused by the BP spill. We had the vegetation on our barrier islands in the state. Our island coves and our sandy beaches were covered with oil. Okay. Next is our timber industry in Terrebonne Parish. Prior to about 1880, timber production in Louisiana was fairly small, meeting local needs. Mills and logging were confined largely to areas along waterways. By contrast, the so-called second phase of lumbering, the industrial phase, was huge in its output. These were the days of giant trees, giant mills, and giant lumbermen, noted the Louisiana lumber historian Ann Burns. In 1880, Louisiana ranked 13th in the United States for the dollar value of its timber product. By 1990, it ranked 10th in the nation, and by 1920, second. In some years in the 1910s, the state led the country in timber production. Several factors came together to make industrial lumbering possible. One, the availability of large tracts of timberland at low prices. Demand for lumber and exhaustion of sources in the Northeast and the Midwest. The arrival of the railroads, and four, the technological improvements in removing lumber from the forests and swamps. So the picture I'm showing here, they called that a pull boat, Basically, it was used to pull the logs from the marsh and through the marsh to a navigable waterway where they could actually push the logs out and get them to market. For the purpose of analysis, mills in the 1917 list with 100,000 or more board feet capacity were identified by parish. There were no parishes in 1917 list with 3 or more large cypress mills or even 2. The following parishes had 1 large, which could produce 100,000 or more board feet cypress, which were 1 each in Ascension, Lafourche, Orleans, St. James, St. John, St. Mary, and Terrebonne. Okay, cypress is more challenging to remove from its natural habitat. In the cypress timber industry of southern Louisiana, workers arrived on small boats to cut timber in the swamp. An amazing 1927 silent film that is shown at the Louisiana State Museum, Cypress Museum in Patterson, shows timber fallers cutting trees from pirogues. In the early days, lumbermen floated to cut logs from the swamps to major streams during the annual spring floods. Invention of the skidder in 1883, the introduction of barges called pull boats, which was the picture I just showed you, and the building of dummy railroad lines into the swamps beginning in the early 1890s revolutionized the industry, making possible large-scale industrial lumbering. The skidders were located either on the pull boats or when rail lines were present on a flat car. When pull boats were used rather than railroads, cypress logs were organized into rafts and floated to the cypress mill, which was often located on a body of water. Lumber companies established camps in communities such as Donner and Chacahula to house their workers. Fallen cypress trees were removed by pull boats and skidders, leaving spider-web trails and wagon wheel trails where the trees had been dragged through the swamp. So the picture that I'm showing you here is the areas that industrial cypress logging took place. So typically there were large mills in these locations. And the reason they were set up here was because of the recent alluvial soils, which is that dark area that you see on the state map, allowed for the growth of those cypress trees over many, many years. Some of these cypress trees that were milled were 1,500 to 2,000 years old. Okay, so that's why we saw the abundance of mills down in the southern part of our state. These are industrial cypress mill towns. As you can see, there was many towns over the southeast area. Specifically, we had one in Gibson, and we had the Donner and the Chacahula mill also in our area. This is an example of the Donner site of where the plant was. Specifically, what I wanted to mention here is you can see it was near the Southern Pacific Railroad, so they could get their product out. Also, on the left-hand side, that little loop that you see is a canal that was dug. It was for the logging, and it goes to a pond where they would float the logs into the pond, and then it was easier to get the logs out of the pond and put them into the mill, to the sawmill, by them being placed in the pond. They had houses for their workers, an office. They also had their own post office, and a lot of these places had their own community stores for the mill. Okay. Fallen cypress trees were removed by the pull boats and skidders, leaving spiderweb trails and wagon wheel trails where the trees had been dragged through the swamp. If you go back and look at 1940 Natural Conservation, what is it? Natural Resource Conservation Service maps from the 1940s. In certain areas of the forested areas on these maps, you can see these large objects that look like wagon wheels. When I first looked at those maps many years ago, it's almost like the UFO came down and made this wagon wheel looking thing. I had to ask quite a few people what that was, and come to find out it was these wagon wheels or these spiderweb trails that were used to pull those logs out of the marsh to go to market. Rapid exhaustion of the cypress forest between 1890 and 1925 with limited benefits to the state led to two constitutional conventions, one in 1910 and another in 1921, to impose a license tax on the privilege of severing natural resources from the soil. So most of you are familiar with our severance tax. So that's when those came about. Although it was too late to allow the state to gain much benefit from the removal of cypress, the taxes would have had a tremendous impact on the state's economy as the oil and gas industry gained prominence. The major industrial means of removing swamp trees were the pull boat and the overhead railroad skidder, both of which resulted in changing swamps as well as producing sufficient logs for industrial milling. The consequence of these logging methods is the removal of the large strands of cypress, dredging of canals, and constructing of railroads in the swamps wrought significant environmental changes to the area. Public sentiment in favor of the habitat preservation developed to some extent during the early 1920s, when negative impacts of tree cutting, the draining of marshes, and digging of canals became obvious. These sentiments were abruptly replaced by the urgency of flood control after the Mississippi River flood of 1927. Land developers bought cut-over cypress land at very low prices because owners didn't want to pay the taxes on it. Elsewhere, the discovery of oil in Terrebonne Parish prompted timber companies to hold on to land and lease it for exploration. The logging of cypress began probably in this area around in the 1890s. So basically, when the logging industry, when the sawmills closed down and the areas of Donna, Chacahula mills were closed, there were many people that were left without jobs. So, but the good thing that happened beginning in the early 30s was the oil and gas industry came in. So those people that were working in the logging industry just pushed over and made a living within the oil and gas industry. After the 1925 heyday of the cypress lumbering, there remained only the cleanup operations that exploited the few remaining commercial stands. Industrial cypress era brought important landscape modifications to Louisiana, especially to the swamps and their highland rims. If the timber was to be floated out, creeks or roads or trails were cut at intervals, usually 1/2 mile apart during the dry season, which could mean either the surface was exposed or was covered with less water during the wet season, which was winter and spring. Pull boat operations required numerous canals in the area cypress was removed. Slips were dredged for log storage and raft making and for the quarter boats and shop boats. Typically, just like the oil field did when they moved in rigs, they would build a little slip to push that rig into. That's what they would do with the pull boat. They would push that, dig a slip in that waterway to put that pull boat in there. Cleared right-of-ways known as a run or trail were cut into the swamps to facilitate operations of the skidders. These runs would turn into mud and water-filled ditches that were often 6 to 8 feet in depth, running the full length of the run. Pull boats could pull logs distances of up to 1 mile from the swamps through the runs. So a lot of these runs were typically 1 mile long. The interesting thing is there are no known survivors of a pull boat in existence today. So you can't go anywhere to see one of these because nobody's been able to find one in and around the area. Okay. Pull boating consisted of not only the pull boat, but you needed a dredge boat, a quarter boat, where the workers lived, and towboats and other small boats. In industrial lumbering, the essential difference between the old and new methods brought greater damage to uncut trees, changes in vegetation, changes in water levels because of the canals and railroad beds, the development of large-scale industry, urban changes, and with most operations, year-round work for all involved. If natural waterways were available, most operators preferred to use the pull boats over the rail system. Canals were frequently dredged in order to get the lumber, but dredging was often very expensive, especially if the canal passed through a region with numerous large stumps. Mattoon reported that the cost of dredging canals had brought ruin to many operators. Stumps were blasted out of out with dynamite. The further the timber lay from natural waterways, obviously the greater was the cost of canal dredging. Canals usually were 30 to 50 feet wide and 6 to 8 feet deep. Okay. This is one of the kind of wagon wheel looking deals. Up at the top left-hand side is the 1,000-foot canal channel that would go to where they could actually pull the logs out to the main stream. Typically, each one of those, they called them roads, but those were the trails, what they would cut through the forest to pull those logs out. Okay, this is one of the skidders that was on a rail car. Basically, what they ended up doing is taking these and putting them on a barge, and then they would have a pull boat with one of these skidders on top. And this is what was used with cables to drag the logs out of the swamp. Okay, last but not least is our oyster harvesting in Terrebonne Parish. European settlers found oysters abundant in coastal Louisiana. By 1890, enterprising Houma oystermen saw opportunities in availability of ice, expanding railroads, and advances in canning. Oysters could now be shipped across the nation. Houma boomed in the early 1900s as oyster processing plants flourished here along the bayou. The celebrated Houma oyster outpaced sugar as the prime commodity during the city's growth. It is said that before the white man entered the territory, the Houma Indians used the oyster as their main food. Its popularity grew with the increased population. In the late 1990s, the idea for packing and shipping oysters began to grow in industry. Oysters are reputed to bring more than $500,000 a year to Houma and provides work for more than 1,000 persons. So this was quoted through the Louisiana Works Progress Administration sometime around 1936. So $500,000 a year of profit into Houma in 1936 was pretty good. Okay. All right. This is a board or a placard that is located near the Water Life Museum here in Houma. I've been there many a times, but never saw this placard. It was put up by the Houma Terrebonne Visitors Bureau, and it's entitled "When Oysters Were King." So the big picture that you see with the people standing around by the building, those are employees and proprietors of C. Snack and Company, 1905. Here along Bayou Terrebonne. Thousands of gallons of oyster meat was shipped out daily in ice-packed rail cars. Mountains of discarded shells were used to pave roads and add grit to chicken feed. 75 million oysters were shipped from Houma in 1905. The Cenac and Company shucking room in 1927, which you can see on the right-hand side, the black and white picture. During its peak years, the oyster industry employed half of the population of Houma, worked at the oyster industry. Depending on availability, men, women, and children worked long hours during the shucking season. Oyster shucking and antique oyster plate, that's what you see up there at the top. Depending on availability, oysters have served as both a staple food for the poor and a delicacy for the rich. And then the man you see on the top right with the yellow-looking oysters, there's a band that goes around there. That's Motivate Seafood, which is producing award-winning gold band oysters in its Houma oyster processing facility, in which they put their oysters under pressure to kill some of the bacteria or actually a virus that could be in that oyster. It was interesting to see this. There's 2 oyster cans there in the middle. So, like I said, this is available to be viewed by the Wildlife Museum along Bayou Terrebonne. Louisiana has approximately 8 million acres of classified shellfish growing areas. Of the 8 million acres, 1.2 million acres are classified as prohibited. In other words, you can't fish oysters in those areas. Louisiana is the top producers of oysters in the nation, and each and every day, 1.3 million Louisiana-produced oysters are consumed somewhere. These oysters thrive in Louisiana estuaries, the coastal waters where salt and fresh water mix. In Louisiana, oyster fishing fish public oyster grounds for seed oysters, those oysters that are less than 3 inches, and they transplant them to their private leases for cultivation and future harvest. They also harvest market-sized oysters, which are 3 inches or larger, from those public grounds when allowed. Most of Louisiana's total oyster harvest comes from private leases, but many of these oysters began their lives as seed oysters on public grounds. In fact, a boatload of seed oysters cultivated on a lease produces an estimated 2 to 3 boatloads of marketable oysters. This successful public-private partnerships help Louisiana to continue to lead the nation in oyster production year after year. The Department of Health and Hospitals has about 800 sampling stations in Louisiana oyster harvest waters. These stations are sampled every month, and further checking is done as needed. State technicians analyze the samples in one of the department's laboratories located in New Orleans or Lake Charles. They're looking for bacteria and viruses that may be affecting the oyster population. The department checks for fecal coliform bacteria. If the fecal coliform bacteria are found, it means the waste materials like human feces may have been dumped into the water. State inspectors also analyze shell stock meat samples as needed. Some of this water, some of these solutions to that was to put in sewer treatment plants when people only had septic tanks, whereas they release their water, it goes into the local bayous, which ends up into our oyster grounds. And the institution of our sewer treatment plants have allowed us to treat our sewer, a majority of sewage in Terrebonne Parish, before it reaches these oyster grounds. The department classifies and reclassifies the oyster harvest areas through the use of bacteriological data and the results of what they call sanitation surveys. Principal sources of feces contamination or fecal contamination: discharges, effluents, bypasses, and pipes from wastewater treatment systems, river streams, creeks, and seeps, vessel discharges, whether they're small or large. For instance, shrimp boats or other fishing vessels that do not have a sanitation unit on board, when they use their toilet, it goes directly into the water. So on-site septic system failures, and also it can be caused by animal waste. To give you an idea, to meet the approved water quality criteria for an oyster reef, it takes 8 million cubic feet of coliform-free dilution water to dilute one person's waste in one day. That's close to 60 million, or slightly more than 59 million gallons of water. That volume would cover 12 football fields with 10 feet of water. That's what it would take to dilute one person's human waste when you dump that into the water. There are naturally occurring hazards such as Vibrio species, which are controlled by monitoring the water temps, bacterial levels in oysters, and occurrence of illnesses of post-harvest processing. It takes good water quality is essential to the production of safe oysters. Once out of the water, the oysters retain what they have accumulated. Oysters must come from approved areas with predictably safe water quality, and preventing the harvest of shellfish from unapproved waters and closed areas is crucial and critical for proper public health protection. Okay, it takes about 21 days. That's how long closures usually last. These are the oyster fishing areas and below south of Terrebonne Parish. And that is the end of my presentation. Okay, next up we have Mr. Al Leveron. Al was born, raised, and currently resides in East Houma. Mr. Leveron graduated from South Terrebonne High School and Nicholls State University. He started his career with Terrebonne Parish government in 1981. Having held various positions with the parish, Mr. Leveron served in the capacity of parish manager during 3 administrations, and he retired from public service in 2017. So Mr. Leveron will give us a presentation regarding environmental mitigation that is taking place in Terrebonne Parish. Al?
Okay, thanks. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Indulge me a minute. Please stand up. Please stand up. Let's get a little, some legs movement. I know mine is starting to get numb. You know, years ago, you'd sit through a police jury meeting, and this would be nothing, right? You'd be ready. You'd have to wait for 6 or 8 hours of meeting with them. Okay, look, I'll just go ahead and start while y'all exercising, all right? So the concept of mitigation, historical mitigation for environmental projects in Terrebonne, you know, now a lot of times we talk about mitigation being kind of how you're going to fix the wetlands. But the concept of mitigation goes beyond that. Through the years, there have been other things that you've had to do to rectify projects or activities of the parish or activities of individuals that had some adverse effect on the environment. So the concept of mitigation is not just related to coastal type projects. And you know, for a long time, at least this is my perspective, that, you know, looking back over the history of the parish and projects, prior to the 1960s and 70s, projects were done primarily based on their cost effectiveness, the efficiency of the project, the commercial benefit of a project, and of course, commerce is very important in everything we do. Environmental aspects of projects were maybe considered, but they were lower on the tier of considerations of making projects a go or no-go. And one that comes to mind for me is looking through the public record through the years. You know, you've heard of the Home Navigation Canal. Well, most people may not know that the taxpayers of Terrebonne Parish actually passed a bond issue and constructed the first Home Navigation Canal itself. Now, we were working with the federal government, and the federal government, you know, they looked at all sorts of things, and you know, by God, they looked at the environment. They happened to point out that, you know, if you do this project, you got to be concerned about shoreline erosion, and oh, by the way, there's going to be some salt water that's going to be coming up the waterway. Well, the project was built. You know, and no real consideration at that time was the project was not mitigated, if you will, or mitigation aspects were not put into the project because that was not the driving force of the project. And now you've heard the other presenters talk about saltwater intrusion, about land loss, and you know, it's just a history lesson as to how things go. So looking back over the long period of time, you'll, as I just said, environment was considered, but not a big aspect of the project. The whole idea of the environmental awareness movement really started with this particular publication. Rachel Carson, she was a conservationist, she was a scientist, and she was a writer. And she published this book called Silent Spring. She was particularly perturbed with the activities of the chemical industries after World War II. There was a proliferation of chemicals that were used for insecticides and things like that, and it really disturbed her because there was no consideration for the environmental impacts of those projects or the activities of the chemicals being washed off and having secondary adverse effects. Well, she started a public dialogue, and really the whole idea of environmental awareness movement started with her. And again, things were, you know, the hippie days, the 60s, and things that people were becoming more aware of themselves and of things around them, the natural environment. Well, in 1970, there was the first Earth Day. You know, we've had... Every year there's some celebration to you know, take pause about what's going on around us in our environment. Well, Earth Day in 1970 was scheduled for April 22nd. The people that were putting it together wanted to mobilize the college crowd. You know, you get a lot of college kids involved with it. April 22nd. Now, why April 22nd? Well, let's see. Spring break was in March. Final exams were in May. So they said, let's do something between then. So that's when Earth Day was formed, and it was activity. The day was identified because it was between those big events, spring break. The first big congressional activity was the establishment of the National Environmental Policy Act, and that kind of drives everything else. I'm not going to get too far in the weeds with these, but this particular legislation created a whole slew of environmental acts, and this one in particular also required that whenever there was any federal money being distributed to any project, there needed to be an assessment of the environmental effects of that project before it is put into effect. Well, these can be in these assessments can be, well, we'll go look at it and we'll put a little booklet together. We'll call it an environmental assessment. Oh, but if it's a big project and much more impacts, we'll have to do a much more detailed document called an environmental impact statement. Mr. DeFreitas mentioned earlier the sewer program in the 1970s for us was stagnated for 18 months and more as a result of the federal government requiring an environmental impact statement to be prepared for a project here in Terrebonne Parish, which was going to use federal grants. So here again, that's how it all falls together. Again, you had an alphabet soup of rules. And again, before that, projects were only done based on the economy and the efficiency. Now, with these laws that came into effect, much more insight and oversight was placed on the regulation of air quality, water quality, toxic substances. Even the Coastal Zone Management Act was prepared. And, Terrebonne Parish is actively involved to this day in its own coastal zone management program. We've been having our own program since the 1990s. And of all of these laws, it seems like the Clean Water Act is a recurring theme, I think probably because of where we're located, right? The sewer program, the water program, oil and gas affecting... I'm going to concentrate on a couple of, and I might add quickly, a couple of case studies that affected us here in Terrebonne Parish, looking back. So the Clean Water Act, we sometimes call Public Law 92-500, it was passed in 1972. Richard Nixon was the president, it's a Republican administration. It was a Democrat legislature. The Democrat Senate and the House passed the law. Nixon vetoed it, and the legislature, the Congress, overrode his veto. And that law was put into place, 1972. How it affected us here locally, and I'll kind of take these out of order just a little bit. It required, well, I can't point this for some reason. I'll take the second one, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. This is the NPDS. It requires, oh, thank you. Oh, yeah, that'll work. It requires any water quality discharge to have permits, and it has to do sampling, and you have to have some accountability to somebody else about the project you're involved in. If it's a sewer treatment plant, you have limits. You need to meet those limits, and if you don't meet those limits, it's bad. And not only is it bad, it may be financially bad. And in some cases, it can be criminally bad. While this Public Law 92-500 did create this NPDS program and required all these permits, and here again in Terrebonne, it was like mostly sewer treatment plants. This law also recognized that, well, if you want to upgrade water quality in the country, you better come up with a financing mechanism. So it authorized an extensive federal investment in local wastewater treatment programs and sewer treatment programs, sewer collection lines, things of that nature. In fact, it was the second largest public works program to date, right behind the U.S. interstate system. So it was a very big funding program trying to upgrade water quality across the whole United States. It also, I mentioned the permits. It requires that you have technology-based treatment plants, and again, not to go too far into the detail, but this right here, BPT technology, was something that affected us all in the business. In 1980s, again, we talked about what you did in the past before the Clean Water Act. I'll take the South Terrebonne Treatment Plant, which was operated by the City of Houma and the Terrebonne Parish Consolidated Government. Well, it was the police jury at the time. We were not meeting our permit limits, and we didn't have any money. Mr. DeFreitas mentioned the delay resulted in some loss of money. We did get some money. We got actually about $50 million in the 1980s. You equate that to current dollars, that's about $200 million. But it wasn't enough to build the South Treatment Plant as required. So it wasn't meeting its permit limits. What does EPA do? It's bad, Terrebonne Parish. They sued us. They sued us to fund improvements at the South Treatment Plant. Well, as it turned out, there was an opportunity for us to get some limited federal grants to complete that facility, and we did. What we did, we found the cheapest method, environmentally correct method of discharging the sewage instead of going into Bayou Chauvin and into Lake Boudreaux to pollute the oysters, which had happened in years past. We relocated the discharge and we rerouted it to the Houma Navigation Canal. Much larger stream flow, less impact on the environment. So that was successful. Now, since that time, we're talking 20 years ago, since that time, they've done further improvements at the South Treatment Plant, a technique called wastewater assimilation. This being the South Treatment Plant, and right here was where the pump station was. We pumped it, keep going past, see that red line? That's the Houma Navigation Canal. We pumped it that far for many years. What we found out in more recent times is that the water that we're pumping away, fresh water, Kerry mentioned, has potential benefit to re-nourish wetlands, degrading wetlands. Of course, it has to be removed, the fecal coliform. It can't be pollution, causing oyster pollution. So what's happening now is the effluent from this plant is actually discharged into this freshwater swamp right here. And the swamp itself is serving as a portion of the treatment system. We're benefiting the environment by adding nutrients. The environment is benefiting the public by removing nutrients and providing for a higher quality discharge to everybody's benefit. One of the other things, going back to the Clean Water Act, the bane of our existence is what we call Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which mandated a national dredge and fill permitting program. So heretofore, all companies, parish governments, individuals wanted to go dig a trenasse, wanted to go dig a bayou, wanted to go do something. There was not much oversight on that. This law, in fact, required that they apply for permits through the Corps of Engineers. And in some cases, when you apply for that permit, you have to prove to them that you're avoiding any unnecessary environmental impact. And if you can't avoid all of them, you have to minimize them at least. And then once you've avoided the most, you've minimized, if you have any further impact, you have to perform what's called compensatory mitigation. You have to provide some method in which to offset those environmental impacts. That could be by creating wetlands of equivalent value that you're damaged. In some cases, you can actually pay a fee to a program that is called in lieu fee program. And in some cases, you can plant trees. You might build a barrier island program. There are all sorts of methods that are involved in the compensatory mitigation program. So 1972 is the Clean Water Act. Well, digress 2 years, the Terrebonne Parish Police Jury decided, you know, we've having flooding problems. We need to come up with a way of providing flood protection for all of our population. They came up with what's called as the parish-wide forced drainage plan. Even went to the voters and got a bond issue approved to build forced drainage systems. And we have hundreds of, not hundreds, excuse me, 20, 30 pumps, forced drainage areas, 100 plus pumps now, Mike. I'm not sure what the number is currently. But the plan was in place at the police jury. We want to do this. We've got money to do this. The Clean Water Act passed, and it says you need to get a permit, but the only problem, there was no permit procedures in place. So the police jury said, well, we're not waiting, we're building. And in fact, they built 5 projects. The 4-1 Pointe-aux-Champs project, a project in Dulac, 4-Point, a project, several projects in Dularge. Dularge was the winner there. And I think it was because of Bobby Mormon was the police juror at the time, and he was very aggressive. He was in the construction business. And started the projects. In fact, we're building them. We're pretty far into the project. The regulations came into effect, and the Corps said, Terrebonne Parish, you need a permit. They, you know, at the time, the powers that be said, well, we don't have a permit. So the Corps of Engineers did something not really, didn't sue us, sue the parish. I keep saying us, it's not us, it's y'all. They issued what's called a cease and desist order. So basically the project had to stop and negotiations had to be held with the Corps of Engineers, and the parish had to agree to what's called an after-the-fact permit, so agreeing that, well, we're going to apply for a permit, and whatever the damages are, impacts, we agree that we will take care of them. Well, the projects we're talking about a 1972, 75 time period. The parish applied for an after-the-fact permit. It was not issued until 1990. So 15 years approximately elapsed where the people in the parish were the beneficiary of the flood improvements and had not yet paid. It was like basically a blank check. How are we going to offset those impacts? Well, it turns out that the parish agreed to manage an area called the Fagu Canal Mitigation Area. Let me back up. I'll show you just a general location of the projects that were involved in the after the fact, or the cease and desist order, I should say. Lower Dularge, this is the on the east side of Bayou Dularge. It's part of, I think the levee board is currently undertaking improvements there. This is the Pointe-aux-Champs area. It really starts in Upper Berg and flows down all the way to the end of Pointe-aux-Champs. It loops around right at Pointe-aux-Champs Road. Now, you might also notice that Montague is right here. Montague already had a forced drainage program, but it was pre-Clean Water Act. So Raul Pellegrin, again, did things for his people before the regulations came into effect. This is the Mayfield or 4-Point area. Initially, the police jury was really only going to construct a project where they had inhabited areas along Mayfield Road or lower Dulac Road, Grand Kaya Road. The Harry Berg Corporation owned all of the 4-Point area. They had their own plan of trying to protect their property. They came to the police jury at the time and met with the then president, Bubby Lyons, and they negotiated a joint project to where the parish actually undertook building the project. Here's another do large project, benefit of Bobby Mormon. This is the area around, I guess, Mormon Ridge. It's mostly sugarcane agricultural area. This was Lower Do Large, Dr. Beatrice Road, if you will. And I mentioned the Fagu Canal mitigation area. This map doesn't do it justice, but this is the permit drawing, and all those drawings I just showed you came from the actual permit documents. Home and Navigation Canal here, and it's basically the area west of the Home and Navigation Canal, bounded by Bayou du Large to the west, and Fagu Canal to the south. This would be an aerial photograph. And this project, going back to, well, what's the mitigation? We talked about salt water was impacting this area. And oh boy, by the way, that salt water was coming up the Home and Navigation Canal, overtopping the banks, because this was really cut through a very low area. So this area was interchanging salt water into this marsh area, which was then a freshwater marsh. The project required introducing flows from the Home and Navigation Canal during periods where water was moving from the Atchafalaya River way over here, going down the Intracoastal Canal from the west to east, and then a lot of that water just flushes straight down the Home and Navigation Canal during certain times of the year. Certain time of the year, there's a positive flow from north to south, but then in some other parts of the year, the predominant flow is south to north. That's when you get all the saltwater intrusion into these areas. So a series of projects, rocks were placed all along the Home and Navigation Canal, a series of weirs and dams, a water control structure to divert water into this area. And oh, by the way, it's a 50-year obligation. So the permit was issued in 1990. The project was built around 1992. Parish has the obligation to oversee this area till 2042. Clean Water Act, again, the bane of our existence. It requires currently, we talked in the 70s, now we're talking currently. Initially we were talking about industrial water pollution from treatment plants. Now they want to permit stormwater. If stormwater runs off a construction site, there can be pollutants in that water. So now the parish has a program mandated by the federal government that the parish implement a stormwater management program, and it requires the implementation of best management practices. That means it's just a certain technique that one can use on a construction site, such as berms, vegetated swales here, where the runoff would go through this and the grasses would collect toxins. This is a certain type of driveway to where construction equipment leaving the site won't pull mud up and down the highways. And this is a requirement on all projects, I believe, over 1 acre. And the higher you get, the larger the site, much more, the BMPs are much more difficult. We talked several times again before about the benefit of fresh water benefiting the marshes. In some cases, this is the lower Pontchartrain forced drainage system. Oh, by the way, this is the protected side. This is the marsh side. Years ago, when the forced drainage programs were installed, all the water was pumped into the bayou, and that resource was lost. Now, there's an attempt to collect the stormwater and pumping it into marshes for the purpose of benefiting the marsh, very similar to the wastewater assimilation program I told you about. Other ways of environmental mitigation: solid waste disposal by burning. I came to work for the parish in 1981. First job I applied for was getting involved in the sanitation program. I didn't know much about it. I was working elsewhere. First thing they said, well, you're going to be involved in the landfills and the dumps. So my wife and I said, well, okay, let's go see what a dump's all about. We drove down to Dularge, and we went to the Dularge dump then, early 1980s. It looked like I was in a firefight in Vietnam. It was like napalm was going off all around us because it was burning. There was open fires everywhere. That was a no-no, obviously. So one of the things, let me go back there. So as it turned out, the regulations, we keep coming back to, your regulations mandated by this time, the early 1980s, that the parish, or all governmental entities, do something about this type of environmental adverse effect. They had to apply for permits and construct what's called sanitary landfills. In fact, Terrebonne Parish, in this case, was ahead of its time. It was one of the first communities in the state of Louisiana to actually construct a sanitary landfill. It received one of the first permits ever issued by the state of Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. It was then called the Ashland Sanitary Landfill. It was operated from 1981 until its closure in 1999. In 1999, new regulations came into effect that says you got to do something different. And it turns out we looked at alternatives to modifying this landfill to meet the then current practices. It was just not cost effective. It was a lot cheaper to find alternative disposal locations. So what the parish did instead was constructed a pickup station to where all the garbage from the parish of Terrebonne is transported to this location in Ashland. It's offloaded from the garbage trucks. It's placed in larger trailers and is hauled to a large landfill in Jefferson Parish. It's called the River Birch Landfill. Now we get back to the concept of mitigation. Most people think of mitigation dealing with coastal resources. And this is basically landscape-wide. Instead of dealing with individual projects, we're talking about dealing with areas of the state, large areas. Barataria Terrebonne Estuary Program was established in 1990. And I'll just take a moment of personal privilege on this one. This particular project, this genesis was in 1986. The Terrebonne Parish Council passed a resolution that requested Congress to consider Terrebonne Parish estuaries as being nationally significant. And the term national significance means a lot when it comes to federal projects, federal funding. If you're nationally significant, it must be something that the federal government has an interest in and will fund. Actually, there are several people in this room. Actually, myself, Arthur DeFreitas, Kerry St. Pé were instrumental, and Mr. John DeFreitas, I might add, in bringing the idea of the Barataria. Actually, forget Barataria for a second. Anybody else I didn't name? We proposed the Terrebonne Estuary Program. We met with the newly elected Senator John Breaux in December of 1986, pitched the idea to him to try to include it in, there was a conference committee going on the renewal of the Clean Water Act. We saw an opportunity that we could stick our name, Terrebonne Parish, into, they were creating the National Estuary Program, and they named 8 or 10 estuaries. We said, Senator Breaux, put our name on it, and it will be nationally significant. Well, that effort didn't work out because he was a new senator. And in 1987, it was not successful, but it was successful. A good idea did come to fruition in 1990 when the Barataria Terrebonne Estuary Program was approved by EPA. It created a comprehensive management plan, and I won't go through all that because I believe we all went there. Here again, landscape-wide planning and implementation. You have to start looking coast-wide. The QIPRA program was started in 1990. Heretofore, it was a great idea to have a project, but how do you fund it? John Breaux basically called it, I mean, this was a few years after he was elected into Congress. He managed to get this particular act of Congress approved. It provided between $30 and $80 million of funds to Louisiana for coastal protection projects on a competitive basis. In 1998, again, it was the state of Louisiana prepared a coastal 2050 plan. Here again, identifying projects, but again, no funding. It wasn't until after Hurricane Katrina and Rita when the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority of Louisiana was created, and you have to give a whole lot of credit to Representative Gordy Dove at the time and Senator Reggie Dupre. They were instrumental in having this particular law passed. It also mandated the compilation of a master plan, had to be technically based to where if there's ever any federal money coming through the pipeline, that the projects that are selected in this plan would meet the muster, that they were beneficial, they would be effective, and they would be long-lasting. In 2017, it's prepared every 5 years. In 2017, I believe the value of the program estimated to correct our coastal problems over a 50-year period was over $1 billion. We're currently undergoing the master plan for 2023. It's likely going to be more. The objectives of the program, the current allocation for the CPRA for calendar year 2023 from the state legislature is $1.4 billion. This is the final area I'd like to talk about is the fresh water, the benefits of fresh water in our area. The Margansett to Gulf project includes the construction of a home and navigation lock project. It's going to be an integral part of Margansett to the Gulf, blocking storm surges coming up the home and navigation canal. What it also does, it has the ability to be operated in a multi-purpose fashion to hold fresh water coming down the home and navigation canal, hold it in its estuaries for extended time, thus using the benefit of the fresh water instead of losing the resource. The project is currently under construction. So when one looks at the vegetation, coastal vegetation study in current day, you see all around this area, you still have some brackish marsh. But we know the story. We've been through this before. If we don't do anything, it's just going to further decline. So the idea of using the home and navigation canal as closing it based on an operation schedule and allowing the water to, fresh water to back up, holding the salt water south. You can see here, this is after 10 years with the program in place and without the program. Now, I looked at this photo a long time, and I read up on it, and it looks to me that in the first 10 years of operation, there's not a whole lot of change, okay? But, you know, for those who wait, you can see after 30 years, the without, here you see all degrading wetlands, further degradation of the brackish marsh. Here you can see fresh water infiltrating this area. You see a lot better scenario here. But unfortunately, the area out here, Lake Whitman and Lake Boudreaux, not so much. And after 50 years, here we go, the without looks pretty dire. Well, here, with, it looks like we still have some saline marshes here that are intact. Again, this is all theoretical. but this is the best we can do. So what are we going to do looking forward? You know, you've been reading the papers, global warming, sea level rise, intensification of weather patterns. Just recently, a report came out. It was reported in NOLA.com. Sea level can go up 4 feet by 2100. Now, of course, hey, we have our levee protection system, and we're going to be living with that and depending on that if all these projections are right. Unfortunately, the areas outside, this is in 50 years, if water level were to go up 2 feet, and you've seen similar slides from Carrie, you've got water encroaching upwards to, you know, up the Chafalaya Basin, almost to Baton Rouge. So I think I'll just leave that with you. How will we respond? Thank you very much.
I'll take that. All right, Al, thank you very much for your presentation. Carrie and Mr. DeFreitas, thank y'all very much. We worked a long time, met many meetings to discuss what we were going to do here. I would like to say, you know, two of my mentors are Al and Carrie. I had opportunities to work for under both of those men, and I've learned a lot from them, and it's been great meeting with Mr. DeFreitas. You know, we go to these meetings, we talk about a bunch of things, and you lead from one thing to the next, and you learn so much about what's happening, and I wish we could talk. We could sit here and talk all night if we wanted to on what we found, and I'm sure they did the same thing as doing research. You start looking at all these projects and what's went on, and you just learn so much about our community and our area. You know, before we leave, I just want to say, you know, you can go on the internet and you can go to Google and you can search almost anything that you want to know about Terrebonne Parish, and you can find some information about it. So, you know, don't leave here tonight with not knowing something, or you wish you would know some other things about other aspects of our environment. Get on the internet, get on Google, find those articles that are available. There's hundreds and thousands of them related to the environment here in Terrebonne Parish, and we just can't talk about all of them. But thank you all for being here. I apologize for the length of time. I hope you guys got a lot of information out of it. And we will be here afterwards for a little while if anybody has any questions, if you want to come up and ask us any questions. So thank you all very much, and y'all have a great evening.